It's the Redbird Reboot Podcast. Are you ready to get rebooted, Cardinals fans? He settles down, at least in the zone, and does not stop running.
Blake Murphy.
This is the identity for the Arizona Cardinals.
The run defense is just horrendous, and it's been horrendous for the Cardinals for a long time.
And Marcos Labrada.
He's going to bring over his philosophy. It should make it better.
Present the hottest NFL podcast from the country's hottest state.
He should be turning around the logo.
Actually, some breaking news we can cover here. This popped up just about, 6 minutes ago.
It's Redbird Reboot.
Welcome in, Arizona Cardinals fans, to the Redbird Reboot Podcast. We've got our mid-season review here, a.k.a. the QuadCast is back for the most part. And then we've got, obviously, Marcos Labrada is here. And we've got our two guests, at least some awesome Cardinals content creators. You can see, at least on the bottom left of my screen, there is Joe Camo, the Cardinal Rule. And over there on the right is going to be Walter Mitchell at WB Mitch. Is it Mitch 13? I have to remember exactly which one it is, Walter, for years. WBJ Mitch, that's right, for that one. So we're here to talk about the Arizona Cardinals. First, let's start and open up a little bit with Cardinals are at 4-4 after beating the Dolphins. They are technically and officially, if the season ended as it was today, in first place at the top of the NFC West division, something that I think a lot of Cardinals fans would have probably said if you had watched this team throughout the season and then said, hey, Cardinals going to be in first place after this amount of weeks without looking at without looking at the scores, without looking at any of the other box scores, any of the other teams. It would have been probably a little bit surprising. But the Cardinals do have a definitive last-second game-winning field goal to get them the win over Tua Tagovailoa in his return and the Miami Dolphins. Marcos, let's start off with some of your thoughts here, and then we can hop in and then be able to kind of do a little bit of a Cards review, as Arizona's in this spot that they really have not been since it feels like the 2021 season, as far as being a competitive team within this division and competitive enough in the NFL.
Well, I can't say enough for the performances of and we talk about, when we talk about good about Kyler Murray, we talk about the good and the bad with him. I will say that him and his connection with Marvin Harrison Jr. is well warranted. I don't know if I can accredit that to a certain ex-Cardinals quarterback who went ahead and did a full breakdown, not only just Kyler Murray, but the entire offense, because there's so many nuances with it. And there's a lot of working parts. But once they got that figured out between him and Marvin Harrison Jr., and knowing that they have that connection again, with both of them being able to connect downfield to there was a scramble drill that happened. Kyler Murray was rolling to his right. He saw Marvin Harrison Jr. have a little bit of a step. He connected on that pass for 17 to 20 yards, which saved a drive. And, seeing that reestablishment of Trey McBride, being one of the big focal pieces of the offense, which we can say almost confidently now that Trey McBride is he is a person that Kyler Murray not only trusts with being able to be able to win his route or be able to win his one-on-one, but also know how to set into the zones where he can smoothly just deliver the ball to him and pick up an extra 5, 10, 15 yards. He is a safety blanket that this Cardinals offense has been needing to continuously keep rolling when it comes to the pass game. Of course, we know that, our offense is supposed to be more run-centric, but you do need a trusty big body like Trey McBride to play as well as he does, and for Kyler Murray to have that trust with him, because he does have a good connection with them. I almost have to replay it over and over and over again when I see how the connection happens. And I saw it with the Chargers where Kyler Murray just threw it into the open space and Trey McBride was there. That's anticipation. That's trust. So I wanted to highlight that part of this game because Trey McBride came away with the most yardage in the air. And now that we had that connection with him and Marv, Kyler Murray went over 300 yards. So that's great. The defense still has a lot to desire. So we're kind of pending to see what happens, with the trade deadline. And we're just kind of nudging and waiting for that. But that's all my thoughts for that.
For sure. Yeah. Let's go with Walter, at least for that one. Walter, this has probably been one of the grittier Cards teams of the last month for the most part. You got a backup kicker who's kicked 3 game-winning field goals. There have been struggles at times for the most part to be able to move the ball consistently, but Arizona's been able to manage the game well enough that they've had a shot at the end. What are some of your thoughts, at least from what you've seen so far, from Arizona versus the Dolphins, and again through this season?
Well, Murph, real good offense at Miami proved that the Cards, when they are getting stopped running the ball, can open things up in electric fashion. So that is no longer a question. It's been answered. That bodes well for the different games we're going to get down the stretch if they can continue to perform at those levels. And because we got some good defenses coming up against the Bears and the Jets before the bye week, and then I wouldn't sleep on the Seahawks either. Their defense has some talent on it, some big time talent on it. So, but I've just, and as for Trey McBride, I had fun writing an article today on Revenge of the Birds about, hey, Trey, some of us loved you when you were picked, because he was on with Kay Adams on Up and Adams saying that, nobody loved me in Arizona when I got picked. I learned that, and I thought it was the ideal place for me, and da-da-da. So I just wanted to, and I had proof because I went back to my my analysis podcast on Red Rain, where I was calling the pick really exciting and enumerating the reasons why. And it was amazing to me that he lasted till 55, because he was clearly I think the elite prospect coming out of his draft. In fact, I had been mocking Isaiah Likely to the Cardinals in late day 2, early day 4. He's a Massachusetts kid who I'm very fond of, and he's doing pretty well with the Ravens. So, and I was so shocked, and bells went off when I heard the name McBride when we got him. But as far as the defense goes, I don't think the current model of giving up touchdown, field goal, touchdown, getting a stop late in the game miraculously, and then somehow the offense finding its groove down the stretch is a model we can sustain. I've been hoping that the defense would be more stingy, blitz more, try to create more turnovers, try to do something to sort of get out of the pattern of how easy it's been to throw against them. It's driving me crazy. Pitch and catch, but we make every quarterback look like, an all pro. And I just don't get it. I mean, the zones aren't working, and you've got athletes to make them work, but it's not happening. Like, I don't see guys picking up man-to-man in zones, and that's what you have to do. I mean, you don't just stand there like a cardboard box. When a guy comes into your zone, you're with him, and you sometimes have to stay with him if you know you can't pass him off to help. So something's got to be done there, and hopefully, I was hoping we'd have another edge rusher by this weekend, because we're gonna have to get after Caleb. But hopefully, we'll get someone else to rush from the edge. And I know this is controversial, but I don't think we can win with our middle linebacker. He's just not, it just aggravates me so much to see Zaven Collins getting 2 tackles a game. Yeah, he's defending the run well. He's not the pass rusher we need. So it sort of weakens 2 spots, in my opinion. So that's something that, I just throw out there. I love Kaiser White's attitude and his spirit and everything. But to me, he's like, he's just not a physical prototype. Or does he have the instincts to, be a key player in the middle?
Right. Let's go with talking with Joe a little bit now, because this is something that I know coming into this season, part of what Cardinals fans, we expected that the offense was going to have to carry the defense. Through probably the first 6 games or so, we're thinking, hey, like the defense may be overperforming a bit in situations where they're keeping some teams at least holding them to field goals. The offense on their side, they would be lights out when they would get into the red zone. It just would be some of those in between the 20s times that you would see some penalties, some other issues. As far as when it comes to looking at where Arizona's strengths have been, it does feel like this is quite a team that was maybe not what we had wanted Arizona to be thus far as we would have loved to have seen probably higher performance on offense, be able to see more sacks or at least a few more turnovers on the defensive side. Some of that maybe would probably have not resulted in some of the blowouts that we had gotten earlier. Obviously, Marvin Harrison Jr. being a big part of that. What do you feel like as far as with Arizona, the places where they've overperformed or underperformed, how do you feel like that's been according to what we expected going into the season versus kind of the reality of where this Cardinals team is right now?
Yeah, I think you make a lot of good points about kind of the team doesn't look exactly like we thought it would. But as I think Marco said, or maybe you said both said, we would have taken this result 4-4 leading division. In fact, that's probably a little better than expected through this early stretch, right? Real quick, I want to add on to what Walter was saying about Trey McBride, though. Does it remind you a little bit of Dan Marley, right? The whole kind of, when he was drafted, Dan Marley, people were even more down on. I think it was more they wanted, they wanted a center when McBride was taken, but people weren't real high on him. And I actually, the video I did on him, if you look back, I make a mention towards the end that I think fans are going to really like this player down the road, right? And it reminded me of a little bit of that Dan Marley kind of thing. And he's become a fan favorite. He's got the charisma and the play, right? But yeah, in terms of the team, and I try to look at things from this big picture roster building perspective and kind of try to see the forest and not just the trees, if that makes sense. And overall, like they're kind of on track with what I would have anticipated. I always talk about there's a 3-year process for an NFL rebuild, the textbook, right? Sometimes teams go away from it. They're a little more advanced, a little more accelerated or not accelerated in it. But like year one, massive roster turnover, a lot of young players, some free agents that are brought in to help install the culture, the systems, and the team just plays hard but can't win very much, right? Well, that's last year, right? Year two, you're supposed to have improvements, a few more value free agents. Your draft picks from year one are a little more experienced. You brought in more draft talent, and the systems are kind of meshing. The players are starting to get their, hit their stride. And in year two, you're supposed to be kind of in that 500-ish spot, right? Pushing for a playoff spot, but maybe not quite make it. And then year three, you're supposed to be a legitimate playoff team, right? That it's the Lions, what they did, right? And if you look at it from that perspective, big picture, the Cardinals are right on track, right? I mean, in fact, arguably, depending on which way they go from here, maybe ahead of schedule. And I think being ahead of schedule comes in large part by having a quarterback who's a veteran who can do the things Kyler can do. That sets you ahead. So the offense has been disappointing so far, no doubt, right? Not putting up the kinds of points. The connection with Marvin Harrison wasn't as good as folks would have hoped. There were a couple of games that were really ugly. I feel like the defense, at least in terms of overall performance, is kind of right where you expected. You expected them. They didn't address the talent enough to be a really good defense. But last year, they were bottom 2, bottom 3 defense. In some metrics, they're still there. But like if you look at yards allowed a game and points a game, they're kind of like 26th, right? 25th. They're like in that middle, the top of the bottom third, if that makes sense, which is better than last year. I do think on defense, I think we don't talk about enough how much the 2 injuries to the Robinson and Ojulari, I think blew up their plans for pass rush. Like they didn't have a strong pass rush, but I think they were going into the season thinking, okay, we've got these 2 young pass rushers. They're going to struggle a little bit, but let's give them the snaps. Let's give them the playing time, lean on them. And as season goes on, they'll get better. And if you look at it, I think if we had both those guys, this defense would be better, right? They might not be, game changers completely, but this defense with those 2 guys. So I think they went into the season expecting those to be their guys. And then the backup plan was Dennis Gardeck. Whoops, he got injured, right? So, but I think with the offense or with the team overall, there's something I kind of want to point out from a big picture perspective, and I tweeted about this. One of the things I see from fans when we're talking about the Cardinals kind of being on track, where expected, maybe even ahead of schedule, when you look how tough the schedule was, is but look how bad they lost in those 2 games, right? Washington and Green Bay. They're like, they played like a JV team, and so I'm not believing them. But what I would say to that is take a minute and look at the schedule and the records and the wins losses for teams that have 3 to 5 wins, like that middle of the pack. Just about all those teams have at least 1 really bad loss, maybe 2. Right? That is not anomalous with the Cardinals. It's a high variance league. Teams have a bad game, and some good teams sometimes have those. So like the Cardinals having those 2 bad losses is not that unusual. Like most of the teams in that tier have that. So the final thing I'll kind of say is where we go from here and where we're at, there are 2 stories about this Cardinals team, 2 ways you can frame it. And it's and I was talking about this on a podcast I was on with previewing the Bears game. And it's which story do you believe about the Cardinals? Story 1 is this team got blown out 2 games, won 3 games by a total of 4-point difference, like total of 4 points, right? With last second field goals, has an offense that has disappeared at moments and a defense that is very young and, not, they kind of, when the game's tight, they seem to kind of get in there, but they're struggling. And so this team is barely in first place in this division against teams like San Francisco that have really good rosters and such. And like this team, are they actually a lucky team who barely won those games and are going to kind of flounder here moving forward, right? Just because they don't have the talent on defense. But the other story that you could also look at this with is the Cardinals had the toughest first 7 or 8 games in the NFL. Like there are legitimate metrics that have said, I forget which website said this, but they had the toughest schedule in the NFL and now have like the 3rd easiest or something like that moving forward. And the teams they lost to had a combined record of 24-7. Like they lost to like top 10 teams, all of them. And the teams that are kind of as good as we are or worse, that the teams in our range, we beat them all. Right? The teams you're supposed to be competitive against and maybe even beat, we beat them. And we lost to really good teams. And the schedule's looking good moving forward. Kyler's playing well. He's this last game against Miami, we saw some things click with his connection with Marvin Harrison Jr. And you have a young defense, which young players, as they get more playing time, get better. And Robinson's coming back. So like, even though this defense isn't great, there's reason to hope they will get better as the season goes on, simply by the fact that these young players are getting more snaps and getting better, hitting their stride. They're not going to be a great defense, but they might move from 26th to 19th, right? And if their offense hits and they can get to somewhere in the late teens in defense, that's good enough to win in the playoffs in the NFL. Maybe not the Super Bowl, but it's good enough to get there, maybe win a first round. So I think they're on track, maybe ahead of schedule. There's some things they need to work on, but overall, as a big picture, I'm actually very happy with where they're at right now.
Yeah, no, it's something where I think I had picked them at this point to be about 3-5 throughout the season. Some people I know had gone a little lower. Some had gone maybe a little bit higher as far as expectations went. But yeah, through Pro Football Focus, it looks like strength of schedule played. Cardinals have had the first overall ranked strength of schedule, aka the toughest when adjusted for the competition, with looking at how players are graded out. That's what their metrics have. And moving forward, they have at least one of the easier schedules in the NFL. There's games remaining against teams like the Panthers, who've been sellers, the Patriots, who have seemed to come out and beat the Jets and the Bengals, and then just look pretty hapless the rest of the time. Something that's going to be really interesting. I think when it comes to when you're talking about like team building, expectations, and even part of what you look for is remembering that the NFL is going to be a series of individual games amidst the entire season. And so you're right on that. Narrative is something that you have to look at, which the narrative, I think, starting for Arizona, a lot of it was disappointment with some of these close losses to the Lions, to the Bills. Looking as the season has grown on, boy, they were like probably one penalty or a catch from Michael Wilson, something away from being able to get that win over the Bills. The Lions have blown out teams like the Titans from 52-14. You're like, oh, Cardinals, their defense right now, Nick Rollis is still bringing, as I like to say, he's like bringing a Cutco knife to a gunfight is what it feels like with this defense, because of the lack of pass rush that you said. it's a place at least where you're able to, as a Cardinals fan, look at not just the second half of the season, but at least be able to see an identity for this team moving forward. And I think what Marcos and I had talked about some was that when there's an identity that you have as a team, there's going to be teams that will try to take that identity away. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen Arizona has had teams essentially attack where their identity had been, whether we're like playing the Chargers this upcoming week, play more zone coverage than anybody. Your receivers are going to have to probably feast to be able to do this because they've been so good at stopping the run. Cardinals instead go out and control the clock, run the ball, and stop the Chargers from getting into the end zone with some defensive plays, maybe a little bit of luck as far as some turnovers, but being able to at least be in position to then run the ball with James Conner. The next week, playing against a really good pass defense that has Jalen Ramsey on it. Dolphins team that doesn't maybe have the same pass rushers as they did before. But we're able to at least see that they came out in that second half and really did figure out ways to keep Kyler Murray upright in the pocket, get his legs on the move, being able to have that close win. And so I think as a Cardinals fan, you're looking at and saying that, okay, if you're trying to reset a culture, you're trying to be able to find talent, you have to ultimately be able to pay that off by winning games. You can't just be in the fourth season of a 5-12 season and be like, yeah, the culture is great. Things are going well and awesome. At the end of the day, the NFL is about production. Marcos, I think one of the things that we'd also mentioned earlier into the season, we talked about, areas like getting the ball to Marvin Harrison Jr., Kyler Murray's identity on offense, running the ball from under center. We've at least seen that these were the fixes that this Cardinals coaching staff and even Amani Ossenfort have wanted to bring in for Arizona to say that that's what the team is going to need to be able to be competitive in a modern NFL. And at 4-4, you can say, hey, there still could be injuries or issues that you can see some drop off, but it does feel like the Cardinals are at least showing that they seem to know what they're doing on some of these fronts. It's building more trust amongst the fans and makes you kind of excited, at least for a year like 2025, 2026, where Arizona will probably have a lot more cash and ability to spend up to the cap because they'll be able to truly more go for it with fixing some of these major needs on defense, bringing in another stud offensive lineman, and being able to be more competitive in the NFC West as some of these other teams' talent has just been kind of slowly declining since the heyday that they had from 2020 to 2024 this year.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, off air and stuff. That's why it's so critical that right now we're doing this when it's 4-4 and not when it's like 2-6 or 6-2, because we both have our perspectives, or we all have our perspectives on what we see where this Cardinals path is going, and we really don't know if it's going to be hey, we're going to sustain this and we're going to keep winning and it's going to be like the culture is going to shift, or we could be going into a tailspin and we don't know about that, and we're like, we're basically, oh crap, we're getting ourselves we're going into like a the bad parts of the season and whatnot. So we really can't like say for sure where the trajectory is. We can't say that this is better than what we expected. At least that's better than what I expected. I think that we're going to have more losses at this point, mostly because of the fact that things were just going to have to get figured out. And plus the defense, schematically speaking and just personnel speaking, I didn't think they were going to be able to put us in position to win games. And it's actually kind of weird because they actually did put us in position this year to win some games and whatnot. So they overshot in some games and then they looked horrendous in other games and stuff. And then the offense, we were being sold that like this offense was going to be like a top 10 offense right off the bat when I was saying this is going to have to take some time because there's a lot of new pieces and this is the first piece, the off season that we're having this group actually gel together and stuff. But what was I? Sorry. So we're gonna speak about the offense, and first we're going with the offense, or we're going with the defense.
Yeah, I was going to say, Joe, let's go down with the offense because we've talked about there have been struggles, some different expectations. People have, for I think the span of 2 weeks, it felt like, Drew Petzing was one of those people at least who was going to have like his name on a wanted poster in Arizona because he was just like was having issues with being able to have the Cardinals be able to run the ball with what wanted to be a run-heavy team. We've seen flashes of that in terms of James Conner. But as far as production would go, Cardinals have just been one of those teams that over the last few weeks have finally kind of come into their own. They've been about top 6 rushing previously. I think it's actually number 7 overall with over 1,000 yards from scrimmage. But before the last couple of weeks, it was like the Cardinals were a team where you're recognizing, hey, teams are, if they take away the run, Arizona's dropping back to throw. A lot of contested catches outside to some of these receivers. It did not feel like at some point that the offense was adjusting as much as we would have liked to have seen. And what I think we'll be able to at least say from here now is over the last couple of weeks, do you feel like that has shifted for Arizona? And what are some of the top takeaways that you've had from the offense on that side of the ball?
Unmute.
There he is.
There we go. I'm trying to be good at muting, so not making noise in the background. Yeah, but yeah, the run game's been good, right? But that was the only thing this team did well last year, right? And so it continues to be good. But the passing game has been uneven. And you mentioned Drew Petzing, and a lot of people are trying to figure out who's to fault, who's to blame for it, and for the struggles. And it did feel like just games in a row where they'd score in the opening drive, and then they'd stall out. And they'd stall out and they'd stall out and get another 2 field goals. And that was it. Right. And they'd lose. And that was frustrating. Now I do think that it's been mostly kind of some schematic stuff, in terms of the passing game side of things. Drew Petzing is in his second year as offensive coordinator, and people, want to run him out of town. And, coaches need to develop too a little bit. And so with new teams, new personnel. So I'm going to be a little more patient. I want to look at the end of the season, right? Where's this offense arrived at then, right? And if they build on what we see in Miami, then okay, maybe Petzing is just kind of finding he had the run game down and was lauded for his play calling and play design. Like people talked about how innovative his run schemes are. And how versatile they were. So maybe he just needs a little more time to get the passing game figured. That's the optimistic story. And Marvin Harrison Jr., listen, I know there were people who were calling him a bust. I mean, that's crazy, right? Yeah, he'll suffer from comparison with Malik Neighbors and his strong start. But I always look at that as like Julio Jones and AJ Green, right? 2 really good receivers taken early in that draft. Both had Hall of Fame careers, right? Pick your poison, right? And Harrison's going to be fine. He's got it all. The only thing that could derail his career is injury, and not knock on wood, right? But a lot of people want to point at Kyler Murray, and he's had his bad games, but I do think it's mostly the scheme. And I'm a big Murray defender. You all know that. And he will make mistakes, but the big picture thing comes back to here because here's the thing I see. People will watch the game and they'll see Kyler Murray overthrow someone or make a mistake, maybe even have an interception. He'll make a few mistakes and they're like, see, he's the problem. But like the big picture, like most quarterbacks have a couple mistakes like that a game. Even good quarterbacks have 1 or 2 bad plays a game, right? And like I think Kyler Murray is a big part of what's kept them in so many games. Some of those big plays, like we don't win, the Charger game without that run, right? That long run for a touchdown. And yeah, he makes his mistakes, but I think his mistakes are within the margin of error of good quarterback mistakes. And my evidence for that is if you look at all the metrics, QBR, total QBR, ESPN's QBR, PFF grades, he's in the top 5 to 10 in the league and all those things. And one of the things that stats are for is helping you take an aggregated look at what's going on and cross, triangulating with your eye test, right? They're supposed to work together. The eye test is Kyler makes some mistakes, but he also makes some really awesome plays. And then when you take the data, the stats, you see, all things considered, if you in the wash, the mistakes and the good things, he is rating top 5 to top 10 in the league. But on top of that, he's also making some really crazy good plays that keep them in. So I think Kyler Murray is definitely part of the solution. And yeah, he makes mistakes, but everyone makes mistakes at that position sometimes. And I do think it is mostly the play calling kind of needing to find its way. Hopefully they did against Miami, and a little bit some of the younger players need to kind of hit their stride, like Marvin Harrison Jr., right? But I am hopeful and optimistic that this Miami game kind of represents for them. Okay, we're starting to figure it out, right? That connection is starting to be developed between Kyler and Marvin Harrison Jr. Petzing's doing some things different with the routes. And I think the routes that he had Marvin Harrison ran were more across the field, right? I think you guys probably looked at that. So I'm optimistic and hopeful that they're starting to turn the corner.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Looking also, at least, and this is probably something we can talk about, Walter. With the Cardinals, we've seen that their passing attack has been one of the weaker portions, given the weapons that they've had with Kyler back. We knew they're going to run the ball a lot, but it's interesting, at least, is when you're looking at how Arizona's game went. If they were rushing for about over 100 yards or so, they were most likely going to win the game. We got to see that early on, with the most part, against the Rams. They rushed for 231 yards. They had losses to the Lions, losses to the Packers. Even after the Bills game, for the most part, they just didn't have much second half rushing whatsoever. The exception here, obviously, is going to be the Miami Dolphins game, where they only rush for about, I think it's 82 yards total. One of those areas where Miami sold out to stop the run. It was not one of those days that Arizona could. They had to adjust and move the ball through the air. And in the Packers game, in the Lions game, and even in the second half of the Bills game, when Jonah Williams had gone out, Von Miller started all of a sudden getting more pressure. The Cardinals had to throw the ball. They just were not capable of it. This is the first time that I think that we were able to see enough adjustments that had been made. Marcos brought up, obviously, the Kurt Warner video, and I have some thoughts on this, but how do you feel like, as far as with this Cardinals offense, with rushing, the job that Petzing has done, and probably some of the criticisms that I think were deserved, now where we're sitting, do we think that this is going to be continuing this trend for Arizona, for Kyler Murray, at least, of the offense kind of figuring itself out more as the season goes on?
Yeah, first of all, what we saw in Miami was Kyler in 2021 in the first 7 games. Curiously, recently, before that game, he was saying that he felt like he's playing quarterback better now than he was back then. I think he has some, memory issues, because he was averaging 100 yards more in passing. His QBR back then was in the 70s after those 7 games, where it is now. So this is this could have been like the Renaissance game for Kyler, because this is shades of Kyler, who was the MVP candidate. I mean, up until the Miami game, you wouldn't say he's an MVP candidate this year, because he's been very conservative. Although this is the best physical shape we've seen Kyler in since the first 7 games of 2021, and that's huge. I mean, Kyler put in the cardio. I mean, he's really worked hard. Of course, it helps now that he's in the building, doing Cliff Kingsbury like things early in the morning and working out, and but his legs now are as strong and as quick as they've ever been. And the fact that he's using his legs in great fashion in this offense means the sky's the limit with this guy, because that's what makes him special. So it seems like he recognizes what makes him special, and he's playing to those tunes, with the way he's running the football and escaping pressure. And boy, does he make incredible quick decision throws off the run. And that's why I say get him out in space more, try to scheme it more, block down on the edge and just let him get out to the flat and have a run pass option. Because in space, the dude is incredibly special. But I wrote an article this week about Drew Petzing, saying credit Petzing's wisdom, because he did a really smart thing last week. Amidst all the scrutiny of fire Petzing, he can't get anything out of Marvin Harrison Jr. I mean, I knew from the beginning they were going to have to struggle integrating Marvin into the offense, particularly when they didn't do it in preseason at all, didn't take advantage. They act surprised like he was going to get clouded in game 1. I mean, come on. They should have been practicing against clouds. But now, we're several games in. We know now where Marvin's good and where he's not good, so they can play to his strengths right now. And then as the years go by, maybe he'll be like Fitz and develop a slot game and stuff. But right now, he's really great at the crossers. He's really good at the digs. Really good on out passes. And so it's so encouraging to see that. And now he's been integrated. Now we know what they're capable of. So, but McBride is a stud. But here's what Petzing did, which was so smart. And with an assist, like Marco said, from Kurt Warner, Kurt Warner proved, no. Look at this. Here are your opportunities. Don't say they're not getting open, because they are. And the passing, combinations, the schemes, Murph, and that, in those videos, that's great NFL game plan, coordination. These are the same, route combinations of the best that Andy Reid runs. The thing was there was this perception that, they can't get open because, and Kyler can't do it. It's not true. So the fact that came out and that Petzing doubled down, I don't know if you saw his presser after the Miami game. They said, "What'd you do different?" You know what he said? Nothing. We executed. And, it takes an experienced coach not to come to, the next week with new plays and stuff. He didn't do that. And that sometimes is a sort of indication to your players that, what we're doing is not going to work. He doubled down on what they were doing. This time they executed it. And that is a very encouraging sign. Here's what I believe. I'll throw this out there to the group, and I'd love to hear your questions, your answers to this. Here is what I believe. I believe that if Drew Petzing was consulted with the number 4 pick, he would not have picked Marvin Harrison Jr. Okay, I think that Marvin Harrison Jr. was picked by Bidwell because he wanted to appease the fans like he always does. All right, and the reason why I also believe that is look at how he said, "Okay, sorry, Drew, but stay tuned to the 3rd round," because just when we thought they'd be rushing, drafting more edge rushers and D tackles, no, we get Tip Ryman, we get Trey Benson, we get Isaiah Adams, all 3 of which factor into what personnel?
Yeah, 13, 12, and 13.
22, 12.
I mean, 12. So it was as if, and I asked myself the question, if Drew Petzing said after Marvin Harrison Jr. was drafted, "Hey, JG, hey, Monty, does this mean you want me to tweak the?" No. Do your thing, Drew. We love it. Just, we'll find ways to get Marvin the ball, but do it within the confines of what you're already doing, because what you were doing was pretty dang special.
Yeah, no, I think it's very good. Joe, why don't you answer at least for what you're thinking as far as with the approach that they've taken this offseason? I've even said, hey, look, if you take a look at the Cardinals Chargers for their matchup, see how those games played out. You're like, boy, Joe, Justin Herbert is just been under pressure despite the fact that the Cardinals don't have the pass rush. And they drafted another offensive tackle this year. Guys were not getting open downfield. The one touchdown that they did have, of course, ended up being one of those cases where it's every time you want to be able to trust one of those receivers, he just ends up dropping the ball for the most part. It ends up being even worse, a turnover to Arizona. And then with how Arizona's worked with the play action game, utilizing the tight ends, it was an interesting case where I think that I looked and said, hey, the way these 2 offenses have almost wanted to be built, you probably feel like that would have been the case. What's interesting is fast forward another week later, you get to see at least what kind of the approach had been, and I think we can take a look at some of the passing charts of this because I think it'll explain a little bit of that. It's been not just one specific area, but it's been multiple different causes and effects, I think, for the Cardinals offense as to why it's had some issues for the most part. The one thing that we can say for sure is the run game has at least been exactly where we thought it was going to be by this point of the year. The passing game was the one that was lagging. Now, if the passing game is able to start catching up, that gives kind of that Swiss Army knife approach of having, hey, someone comes in with this tool, I've got some scissors for that. Someone comes in here with this blitz look. Well, I can be able to at least bring in a full-on 13 personnel thing to be able to get some max protect, take a shot outside. Teams are having a little bit of a light box to be able to make sure if you're trying to spread them out, having Kyler's legs to be able to take advantage of a team that's bringing that fifth guy off of the edge to try to be able to keep an extra body in the run game. These are all things that I think as Cardinals fans, we've looked for and wanted to see, but it didn't seem like it's been able to truly come together up until that second half of last week.
Yeah, and Walter makes some interesting kind of thoughts, perspectives and such that he brings to the table. And it's hard to know what's going on in the room, right? We're all kind of speculating. I think actually Marvin Harrison very much fits kind of what they were trying to do offensively. But like again, big picture, like look at when Gannon took over as defensive coordinator for the Eagles, right? First year, they didn't they didn't invest as much in that defense as they did in the second year. And there were stories out there that his kind of what he basically said was, hey, take care of the offense and I'll coach up the defense, as coordinator. And then in the second year, they got him some more help, right? And I do think the big picture plan for how to build this team was focus on the offense first, build a run-heavy offense that's going to control the ball and matriculate the ball downfield and keep the defense off the field because they're going to be young, right? And kind of, control time. So run-heavy offense and so that the defense doesn't have to be on as much, and then they can kind of win games, kind of like what the Chargers game looked like, right? But hopefully make a few explosive plays here and there. And within that, right, that 12 and 13 personnel, where you run heavy, what you want is guys on that offense who can convert third downs and can convert in the red zone, right? Like Neighbors is a great player. He's explosive. He can do a lot of things, and he can do those things. But like the kind of the type of offense where you're driving the ball downfield and occasionally getting some big plays, but more just keep sustaining drives to kind of chew the clock and keep the defense that we've talked about as reliability off the field. Kyler can extend those plays with his legs, right? So that's one. You've got one guy there who can absolutely do that. And then a guy like Marvin Harrison Jr., his strength is route running, body positioning, supposed to be 50-50 balls. I know he's struggling in that, but I think he's going to get there. Finding those, those open spots in pockets in the defense and making those big plays to convert those, like that catch, right? On they had to look at review it to call it a catch, right? In the game against Miami, those kinds of plays, right? So yeah. I actually really think the Marvin Harrison Jr. pick fits perfectly with this because he is that guy who, for his age, is very savvy without route running and can kind of, know what to do in those situations. And their hope is between him, Kyler, and Trey McBride, when they're running the ball and those times when they have to convert those third downs because they got to 3rd and 3, right? Because they ran the ball a lot, that they can do that. And then in the red zone, which they've been really good at, right? I mean, they were perfect in the touchdown to go, right? Mm-hmm. Goal to go situations in terms of touchdowns. So from my perspective, I actually think that fits really perfectly. But again, we're all speculating. We don't know exactly what the conversations were inside.
Yeah, no, I think obviously we can talk a little bit, Marcos. You and I think we're kind of in the debates of figuring out like who is the top receiver, what was the place, do they need a receiver? I think a lot of what you mentioned, Joe, is important here to remember is that the Cardinals underwent not just a change as far as within their coaching staff, as far as their identity. They changed everything internally from their grading system to how they valued prospects. One of the best ways that I can at least picture some of that is just how the draft changed for the Cardinals between 2022 and 2023. So entering the 2022 NFL draft after like years under Steve Keim, looking at where the team was, they're in this win now sort of mode because JJ Watt's probably in his last year. There's an extra year for DeAndre Hopkins, but he's going to want to be able to get paid at the end of this season. You've got guys who are aging out, who are offensive linemen. The biggest needs that the Cardinals really had was they're going to need to get someone else who can be able to be across from Hopkins because we were seeing in this air raid spread out type of offense, it really was dependent on guys being able to win those outside routes. And so there's questions like, can Cliff Kingsbury, is he going to bring, there's the charts everyone's seen of DeAndre Hopkins running the same sort of comeback routes on the same side of the field the entire time. You're also looking at saying, you're going to need to be able to adjust on this offensive line to how teams are going to play you. One of the best ways you can probably do that is say, get in another tight end. Zach Ertz was one of the guys they signed to a nice long contract, at least for the next 3 years. He was someone where you're saying he's good, but they need to be able to probably move to more of this 12 personnel blocking system because teams are going to adjust to these wide receivers and this spread. And we saw it play out during that season. In fact, we've seen how teams eventually were going, hey, Chiefs are using this air raid scheme. They've got all these different receivers. We're going to throw on these types of cloud coverages. We're going to throw on these types of, everyone says the cover 2, the Tampa 2 defense. It's that cyclical nature of the NFL where teams are going to be, throwing the ball with these receivers, outrunning guys, having teams spread out while our team's going to respond. Well, they're going to then load up on pass rush, load up at least on being able to play with everything in front of it, force you to play quarterback, make these quick decisions. And I think what we saw with Arizona in 2022 was the Steve Keim methodology. And this is something I think we've talked about with you, Walter, and Joe a little bit for sure. I know I have with Marcos. The go for it every year mentality that Steve had is because the NFL is a short memory span. You got to win now because your next contract may not come. Things may just, bottom may drop out. But if you look at in 2022, Cardinals were like, you needed a wide receiver. You needed probably an offensive lineman, if not a center. You probably needed to get a pass rush for the most part. And you needed someone who'd be able to kind of spell Alexa of a James Conner. So what do the Cardinals go out and do? They trade their first round pick for Hollywood Brown. They're not able to trade up to get one of those receivers in that year's draft. They have on the board at that spot an actual starting center in Tyler Linderbaum. Now, the Ravens ended up making that trade up, take Tyler Linderbaum because they needed a center. Cardinals are like, hey, we need a center and a receiver. Let's get the guy that Kyler's familiar with. They then go in the second round, take Trey McBride. And part of that, I think, is when you take a look at how the draft played out for that year. The player that know that, at least from hearing pre-draft, what the Cardinals were looking for was a guy who had actually gone earlier to the Philadelphia Eagles and is starting for them now in Cam Jurgens at center. A couple of picks later, you're looking at some of the Cardinals. All right, well, hey, maybe you could have gone with Tyler Linderbaum in the first round, go back and getting, a wide receiver in the second round. Like George Pickens, Alex Pierce, Sky Moore, all of those guys were gone. The last guy as far as on their board of needs was it Trey McBride. And after that, Sam Williams has not really turned into anything. And as far as the NFL, what we've seen, and everyone's had struggles. When it came down to it, what the Cardinals would really do is they would approach their draft and say, here are the needs we need to fill. We've got these rookies. And this is kind of was the pattern, I think, under Steve Keim. Hey, Cardinals need a defensive playmaker, grabbing Isaiah Simmons. Cardinals need an inside linebacker. They're going to draft Zaven Collins for the most part. What we've seen with Monty Ossenfort has been kind of a shift in terms of how they would attack the draft. So in the start, we looked at Will Anderson. They need a pass rusher. I think what we've seen in retrospect now with DJ Humphrey's injury, with having a young franchise left tackle under contract while Kyler Murray is having, his $35-40 million a year contract is there. The Cardinals are still addressing some of their needs, being able to get it, but they didn't go and force it. With Paris Johnson, they forced and said, hey, we're going to trade back from a Will Anderson, but we're going to move up and get a franchise caliber guy because we know that's how we got it built. They went out and got a linebacker who's really an edge rusher in B.J. Ojulari, who has unfortunately had injury issues. Garrett Williams, someone who's blossomed this year. These are some of the needs that the Cardinals had, but instead of going out and addressing it in free agency or making a trade for one of those guys, they kind of said, we can take this year, build from the foundation moving up. And we've seen a lot of these different guys like Owen Papo's been able to get on the field. Dante Stills has been starting. And then when it comes into the 2024 NFL draft, this was an offensive heavy draft. I'll go ahead, but real quick with what you're about to say. I know you got something you're looking at on that.
Before we turn that page is, I'm sorry to Cardinal fans who think this, but passing on Will Anderson Jr. is an egregious error.
I agree.
This was. I mean, if you don't have a plan B and if you have pass rushers in place and stuff like that, you can, because they haven't done squat since. And here we are now thinking about year 3. I mean, B.J. Ojulari was a gamble. He's coming off a knee injury, and his production was never that good in college. I mean, it was just a flyer. And the thing is this is what precipitated the move of Zaven Collins. They looked at his height and weight and thought, oh, we'll turn him into the next Will Anderson Jr. And it hasn't worked. And so not only that, they could have had Brian Branch in the second round. I mean, you add those two and you keep Zach Allen, who, by the way, Zach Allen and Brian Branch, Zach Allen and Will Anderson Jr. are two of the top 5 pressure guys in the NFL this year. So, I mean, and here's the other thing. I'm sorry, but we had 3 tackles who were graded in the 70s or close to the 70s on the roster. I mean, and this was just Kyler recruiting a tackle. Now, don't get me wrong. I love PJJ, and he's emerging as a great leader and this and that. But you can't look anyone seriously in the eye and say that PJJ would have more of an impact on this team than Will Anderson Jr. It's just, we got to be realistic. And now we're like in panic mode, trying to, find an edge rusher that still hasn't been conceived by Monty. I mean, just had to make that point.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Go ahead, Marcus.
I'll go ahead and second on that. The reason, so I've talked about this when it comes to like tackles, and what it means to like a team now, and what it is to like the success of a team. And I believe Joe, you had a person who used to work at PFF. He has this thing called a weak link, or a terminology called weak link.
Yeah, Eric Eager.
Eric. Yeah. There you go. So you want them to be as close as possible to each other, to being like a good offensive line, more so than you want, hey, I got this stud that blocks in the 90s, but I have like a need at left guard or a center, or they're like they're down here, but this guy's up here. So it's like with coverage as well. And he even brought that. It's funny because he even brought that up with coverage as well. He said, well, it's a weak link position too. It doesn't just come down to one person. It comes down to the entire unit, putting up the performance. So I rallied, and I got a lot of crap for what I say about, I forgot and I even forgot his name because it's Josh Jones, because I saw the film and I watched it. I had to watch it like twice. I recorded all the every single pass play of the 2020s,
right?
2022. And I watched it again because somebody did bring it up to me on Twitter. Said like, why are you simping for Josh Jones? Like, Josh Jones is a practice squad body. And I'm like, well, we had him in the building and we knew what he could do. So then I went back to look at those snaps. Aside from the penalty, thing that they hit him with, like, oh, he gets penalized too much. So does DJ Humphries. Look at right now with Paris Johnson. He's like, he wasn't penalized as much until this last game. And it's like, yes, but if you have a good offense and the guy brings good overall like pass protection, you can kind of offset it. I think, what did they say? The left tackle from the San Francisco 49ers, the mainstay,
Mr. Trent Williams.
He's one of the most penalized left tackles in the league. So that's just, I'm throwing it out there because that's his first time getting consistent snaps, and to have him be there for the first time getting consistent snaps, and he's grading better than any of your offensive linemen, playing his natural position. And don't get me wrong, go back to the 2020s to see where he was supposed to go in the draft. He was supposed to go in the first round. He was a first round type 2B offensive lineman. So we got him in the third. So regardless of what people say, that was a steal from that draft. So you had him waiting in the stables. I'm like, okay, that's the plan. After Cliff Kingsbury got fired, Monty Ossenford comes in. We play him in preseason. People put up like, look at how he's playing at right tackle. Then we get rid of him for a 5th rounder. I'm like, what are you doing?
Right.
So to me, I was like, well, yeah, we drafted Paris Johnson, but we had this guy waiting in the shambles. Why couldn't we keep him? Why couldn't we keep him and then have him take over for right tackle, left tackle? We could have drafted somebody in the 2nd round, because 2nd or 3rd round, we could have something. No, we go in and get Jonah Williams this year, which Brett Coleman and EJ Snyder do not like that pickup.
And he's missed most of the season.
And he's missed the entire season. He played two 2 quarters against the Bills and then got injured. And that's the criticism you hear from the Bengals fans. Bengals fans are like, oh, yeah, we're glad he's gone. You guys want him? Go ahead. So with me, it's like, to me, it feels like we let go of somebody that was a bona fide player that we thought we were going to draft, and Will Anderson.
Right.
We moved back. We stay put. I mean, that's fine. You can grab a tackle there or something. But we move forward again to get Paris Johnson, and now we have to do moves like, hey, let's get rid of. We're not bringing back DJ next year. Which, by the way, I'm not heartbroken about leaving DJ. But Josh Jones, I'm like, you had a good tackle and you gave him for a 5th round pick, and now he's whatever now.
Yeah. One more quick context, Murph, is what Joe was saying about, well, Gannon's first year in Philly, he said, I'll go with what I got. Let's just remind ourselves who he had. All right. He had Josh Sweat at one end, Javon Hargrave at tackle, Fletcher Cox at tackle, Derek Barnett at the other end, then TJ Edwards in the middle, and Kaiser White playing his best position, which is weak inside linebacker, and had one of his best seasons. Yeah. And then you had Stevie Nelson at corner, Darius Slay at corner. You had Rodney McLeod as a strong safety, and Anthony Harris at free safety. That is an all-star team. Mm-hmm. I mean, poor Gannon saying, the problem is we're not attracting big-name free agents either. So, I mean, how's this defense ever going to get good? I mean, unless you really address it from the top. And, again, I mean, we're drafting offense in the first round. I mean, it's just take care of the offense, but then Gannon saying, well, you can wait on me. No, because here's the thing. Gannon's hanging a 30-year-old defensive coordinator out to dry. I mean, you're not giving him the tools to create some confidence, are you? I mean, look at this defense right now. I mean, here's my problem with it is they've got athletes. They're not coaching these kids right. I mean, we're not playing coverage the way you should. Now, we're not getting pass rush, but you got to create it, right? And this was the same problem they had with Gannon and Rouse in Philadelphia. They said, where are the blitzes? Why all these soft zones? And so we're saying the same thing, only with inferior players and no all-stars other than Buda Baker.
Yeah, and it's somehow against all odds, they're still 4-4, which is interesting. I did want to at least bring up one of those, because I agree with you guys on Will Anderson. I was one of those people that year when people were saying, you have to trade back, you have to move down, whatever the cost is. My thought was, well, here's the case. You're going to, by passing on a pass rusher, you're going to need a pass rusher, because the way that the NFL works is it's contained as far as it's essentially almost a zero-sum game in some ways, where it's like the chessboard's going to be that you only have so many limits because of how the cap works. If you got cash, you can push things back as many years as you want for the most part if you're there. And we all know that Michael Bidwell is a legacy owner. It's going to be very different from having the Walmart money. It's not like it's going to be Jerry Jones as far as with the monster that he's built. But I agreed and said that year it was very interesting to see that the Cardinals, who needed a replacement for Chandler Jones, did not go out and get a replacement for Chandler Jones. And instead, they trade back with the Texans, who we can see, at least from how they built their team, really were taking advantage of finding a rookie quarterback, be able to use that rookie quarterback contract for both their top pass rusher and for their top quarterback. We saw them go out and sign Danielle Hunter, be able to trade for Stephon Diggs. They've had some injuries that have hit as well. What I think was interesting with Arizona was that they immediately gave up those picks, went up and got Paris Johnson. And I think we can see why in the week leading up to the draft. So leading up to the draft, a lot of people will forget this, but the Cardinals had their OTAs and their minicamp, and DJ Humphries was not healthy enough to practice. So you're like, okay, he finished the season healthy last year. It's been all off season, and he's not really able to come in. This is a 29-year-old guy. If you're holding him out for issues, like, sure, but that's usually the case with, a 35, 36, 37-year-old guy. it felt like, and this is part of just thinking through of his knee injuries in college, it seemed like the Cardinals knew he probably had a limited amount of time left to be able to keep continually playing at that high impact role. Part of it is we saw it with his contracts. He never got that 5-year fully, would say market value deal. It was always these smaller 2-year deals that he would get. I think that we got to see with Arizona, they at least were understanding some of that internally that, hey, we know we're not going to be able to get that edge rusher. And I think that the sacrifice they made of that is what we're seeing on the field. We saw they invested in getting a Darius Robinson, and what I think we can all at least agree, it was I wouldn't say, like, you can't even say it's a whiff, but through 2 seasons so far, like you said, it is one of those plays of opportunity cost by saying we have to get a pass rusher in here because we just don't have edge rushers, because of the likes of a Cam Thomas, at least, who the Cardinals have traded. Other players is like I believe Michael Sanders as well, Myjai Sanders, I should say. They ended up passing at least and being able to get one of those guys in a Brian Branch that you've talked about. You've passed on being able to get one of those players that really, from that trade down that they did, could have been a difference maker. Now, that being said, for the 2024 NFL draft, to show you guys this, it was not a defensive heavy draft. The first defensive player did not go until pick 15. It was Laiatu Latu. So I don't know if you guys have been following as far as for what Latu's been doing so far this season, but he's an older prospect, and he's so far had, I believe it's total of 2 sacks for this season.
Yeah.
It's not something, and this is obviously there's rookies, right. There's the guys. This was not an impact draft for a top pass rusher. Last year's draft, you had that impact rusher in a Will Anderson. This year, it was all about the offense. And what we saw at least was, I think I remember someone talked and said, hey, like, I'm going to not bet that all these quarterbacks go first round because we've never seen 5 quarterbacks go, in the top 10, much less the top 15 picks. Well, this is the year where all of a sudden the Atlanta Falcons pull the trigger on the Michael Penix. Like, all right, you see a J.J. McCarthy go. You see Bo Nix kind of be the guy for that. And that pushes a lot of your other offensive talent, Marvin Harrison Jr., Joe Alt, Malik Neighbors, much less, down to some of these teams. When it came to how Arizona then built out the rest of this year, we saw them continue to really double down on some of these players. They took a Darius Robinson over a guy who I at least had liked in, I think it was, went in the second round for the most part. Johnny Newton was someone who I thought was an impact interior lineman. They take Darius Robinson. Robinson looks great, ends up getting injured, something that hadn't been the case the last couple of years. They trade down from getting a Kool-Aid McKinstry, take a Max Melton, and really invest into the physical combine freak type nature. We've seen some penalties. We've also seen him have sometimes one of the better grades for the Cardinals, where you're like, wow, it's like you're watching Garrett Williams and you're watching Max Melton go out there at least and be able to be consistent. You look at how Benson hasn't added as much. Isaiah Adams, we've seen as how he's been as a player. His run blocking grade looks fantastic. Pass blocking grade has probably been the worst on the team when he's been out there. But they at least have kind of built and set themselves up for the future. Like, you're going to say when Starling Thomas is going, or if Sean Murphy Bunting, if he goes, Max Melton able to step up and fill that role once that injury takes place. We haven't had a James Conner injury yet for the most part. We'll see if they move to a Trey Benson. Do they bring in a Michael Carter? We can see that they're probably going to have a hard time bringing a Will Hernandez back next year, but at least you're able to kind of see them not just building for the future, but offensive player, offensive player, offensive player, offensive player. And these guys have all, for the most part, made some impact, with the exception, of course, of a Trey Benson and with Christian Jones being out for the season. I think when it comes to building some of these areas forward, what we're seeing is that the Cardinals have kind of shifted their approach from, hey, instead of saying we are going to win now and here are the positions we need, they're saying we're going to play into the strengths of the draft and some of the strengths that we see as we build this team. Because if I was building this team, I'd say you need a pass rusher. Go take your Will Anderson Jr. You got another year with DJ Humphries. I would have probably been wrong. The following year, Cardinals would probably be taking, in this year's draft, Joe Alt, because they need that left tackle. So it's very interesting to see, like, how you're talking about over time being able to build drafting to some of those strengths. And if they said they need a pass rusher this year, like, I probably would be saying you'd be trading up for that 24 spot to get a Laiatu Latu, to get a Jared Verse. What we kind of have seen is that we haven't, unfortunately, been able to see what they've been able to do with all of that. But none of these guys have really blossomed as far as for being that top edge rusher. And I think it's one of those places where, yeah, exactly. Verse has been the top guy, at least within the Rams, but the Rams against the run, that defense has not been good. Like, they've had injuries, they've had a very young defense. You took a Aaron Donald off of the field, you put a Jared Verse on the field, and you're like, oh, like, can you imagine if it had been flipped around, where if it'd been like, hey, Cardinals could take Chandler Jones off the field, put a Will Anderson Jr. on. I think that when it comes to some of how this team is building, to me, it gives some optimism, because it seems like the Cardinals, they know, hey, we've paid Kyler Murray his money. We've paid Cliff Kingsbury. We've paid Steve Keim. We're going to have to probably reset some. They've at least been able to bring in and have this work with young talent. Like, when you talk about the 2022 Cardinals, who are your top players? You've got, obviously, Kyler Murray's there. DeAndre Hopkins was there. They let Christian Kirk walk, brought in Hollywood Brown with 2 years left on his deal. DJ Humphries is one of your top players. Also, of course, Rodney Hudson was in the last year of his career. Who are your top offensive guys now? Well, it's Trey McBride. It's going to be that Marvin Harrison Jr. We've at least been able to see that they've got Tip Ryman waiting in the wings. James Conner is still checking along, but they don't have to go out next year if James Conner leaves. If James Conner gets a much bigger deal, they at least have someone who's waiting in the wings. Or if you're going to say, hey, we took a flyer on Trey Benson, it was a 3rd-round pick, let's go out and get a guy and maybe a heavier running back draft that we like to kind of pair with him to continue running the ball. It just felt like that the Cardinals had went from having a lot of these aging stars to having some younger stars on the offensive side of the ball. And last week was the first week we got to really see some of that play out, in my opinion.
Yeah, can I jump in here?
Go ahead.
Because
Mm-hmm.
I'm probably the one person in this panel who doesn't mind the Paris Johnson Jr. thing. Will Anderson's great, and he is all-world pass rusher, so not at all dismissing that. I just don't think it's the kind of mistake you all seem to think it is, and obviously we have our different opinions. Like Josh Jones, I loved Josh Jones, but he had a 49.6 PFF grade with Houston, and he has played 9 snaps. And listen, I think that there's something there, but he's not starting somewhere, and people are looking for tackles. So, like, if we didn't go with Paris Johnson Jr., like, would Beachum be our starter right now at left tackle, and who would be our right? So I think we would. It's easy. Hindsight's 2020, but we would be pulling our hair out. Those of us who don't have hair would be pulling our beard out for, like, where's our left? Where's our protection? This offense can't do anything if we can't protect Kyler. So, like, from a process perspective, I don't mind that, because, like, you got, again, hindsight's 2020, but look at it from the process. They got their left tackle. They wanted to get the offense to where it could work, right? That was their first priority. So they get the left tackle. They knew DJ was older. DJ Humphries and some injury problems. They apparently weren't so sold on Josh Jones for the long term. And they're like, yeah, Will Anderson's great, but let's get our left tackle. And in the second round, we'll get BJ Ojulari, right? And then we'll draft another pass rusher next year. I know he's injured. It's easy to say that in retrospect, but the process was, let's get our left tackle. Yes, we're not going to get as good of a pass rusher, but, like, I look at the Baltimore model, right? They draft pass rushers in the middle rounds and just keep that pipeline going, and they develop them. And then you get a Zadarius Smith, who's really good, right? And you get guys like that through that process. And I think that's their plan, is, like, let's develop and coach up pass rushers. Let's get the offense right first. If you have a different philosophy, there's different ways to build a team. So I'm not saying that, like, it would have been wrong to go with Will Anderson, but it's harder to find that bookend left tackle if you're not drafting him early. So, like, I don't mind that, but big picture, I love the overall approach. And you talked about it, like, in the past, it was like bring in aging veterans and you're patchworking and trying to keep win now. And Monty, or take, big playmakers on defense, linebackers that don't end up being playmakers for you in the first round. And Monty is subscribed to a really sound draft strategy. And Marcus, you mentioned Eric Eager, the weak link philosophy. He's also got a great article that I've shared in the past from Sumer Sports on kind of how you approach the draft. And they're, in general, premium positions early, non-premium positions late. That's the smart way to draft. And we may disagree about whether he should have gone tackle, defensive end, but I think we can agree he's going premium positions early, right? Tackle, receiver, cornerback, right? Edge, second round, right? And first round, back-to-back years. That's still early with an edge, even if it's not the guy we wanted. Non-premium positions, linebacker, interior offensive line, right? Safety, middle day 2 or late day 2 and day 3, right? That is the way you build, right? That is the smart way. And as much as we wanted that center in the first or second round, and they would have been great players, look, we were able to find Froholt, who's been a top 10 center and solid for us. And now we've got Trey McBride, right? Yeah. And you that's what you do. You draft guards and centers in the third, fourth round and develop those guys, because you find good guys at that position there, but it's harder to find good receivers and stuff like that there. So
you can find good receivers every year. It'll cost you a first round pick, has kind of been the case for the most part, as we've seen with this last year. And I was with you, Joe, because after we found out and saw, Humphreys isn't practicing, and like knowing his history with Indy, I was like, okay, I'm completely on board with this. I know you're going to struggle at times with the pass rush because of the opportunity cost. But if you're going to then have that pass rusher, your opportunity cost would then come at the offensive line. And what we've really been able to see with this season has kind of been in a proving it year for Kyler Murray through 8 games. It's going to be hard to ask to prove it more. There's at least anticipation that things are going to grow bigger if they do get a Jonah Williams back, as we do see some of these other players, at least like Marv as a rookie, be able to step up in this offense. And I agree that the way that they're at least building their team, they've had some time. Steve Keim and Cliff Kingsbury, it felt like they had to kind of go out and win every year because that second contract was really hinging on them being able to make that rookie quarterback contract pay off. They were able to do it in 2021. Things obviously just were not able to continue as other teams adjusted, as injuries mounted. We went from, we talked about DeAndre Hopkins not missing games to Hopkins missing quite a few games as he just kept getting older, some more issues that seemed to pop up. I think that at the end of the day, when it comes to it, this is a team that you feel like is not a team that's rising and then is going to be kind of falling off. It feels like there's still a lot of work to do. And I think the way that starts, obviously, we can talk about this now, Walter, is on the defensive side of the ball. The Cardinals are still ranked 29th defensively overall in PFF. They have really struggled in terms of being able to get off the field last week against the Dolphins. They gave up, I think it was something like, was 13 of 15 third downs for the most part. It was only that last third down play that they were able to get a stop, get off of the field. They really have struggled because they don't have healthy defensive linemen for the second year in a row. As far as the coverages go, you're right. There's young guys in coverage, Starling Thomas, Melton's out there, Williams. They've honestly not been too bad as far as within coverage when they've been able to get pressure. Last week, though, it felt like it was the best game that I've seen from their linebackers, where they were able to, even though they got run up on a ton, they at least were able to have some different blitzes, some different looks, be able to get just enough pressure on Tua to force a couple of those missed throws. But you do feel kind of like you're starting from Budda Baker and starting from Jalen Thompson, and you're running out your guys who have been stalwart in the past, were usually backups like a Gardeck and others. You're having to kind of build from the ground up, and really it's going to be an interesting question. Do you think that we've seen enough from this defense to say Cardinals are spending less than anybody on defense over the next few years as they sign free agents, as they draft defensive players, as maybe some of these guys in Ojulari and Robinson get healthy? Does that give kind of reason for improvement, or is there still concern, at least, that Arizona to this point could be a 5-3 team if they had, invested a little bit more on defense, or things had shifted a little bit differently?
Well, I have the problem with the scheme. I just don't think I think it's a scheme that'll work with, 6 stud pass rushers, but a whole lot of soft zone and no blitzing or little blitzing isn't going to get it done in the NFL, because quarterbacks are just too savvy against zones these days. I mean, to hear Trey McBride talking about what he and Kyler do against zones, and it's just pitch and catch is too easy, and you got to make it difficult. I see, conversely, our receivers are getting pestered game in, game out. It was rare when we find one of our receivers wide open. So I'd like to switch that around and make that at least have our guys pestering their guys. And we got guys who can do it. When they're playing man, Max, and not too huge cushion, Max Melton's been pretty dang good. So is Starling Thomas V. He's been pretty good. I love Catrell Clark. They don't. I can't still can't freaking understand why you're drafting 5 cornerbacks when you drafted a baller like this and you don't play him. And then the best pick in the draft, other than Marvin Harris, talent-wise, in my opinion, other than Marvin Harrison Jr., is Dadrion Taylor Demerson, who is an absolute stud, and you're not even playing him. I mean, and this kid can play the slot, corner. He can play. He's a Brian Branch type player who's got, you look at his feet and you look at his instincts. I mean, he has got a motor and an instinct, nose for the ball. I mean, so, but here's the main thing is that look what Monty's done on the edge. He didn't add anyone except a 5th round pick flyer and Xavier Thomas, who is like Ojolari, a physical specimen, highly recruited coming out of high school, but never really produced on the college level. And we're seeing him now, and he looks lost.
Julian Okwara has been starting over him, at least in that spot. He was a free agent. So,
So, and then who is Monty drafted to address, inside interior line? I mean, Dante Stills is the best one, and they got him in the 6th round, right?
No, they drafted Darius Robinson for that, and
but
so far that's
right.
He's been hurt, and so
tweener kind of, and he will help that. That's absolutely correct.
Zach Allen type.
You need a knock and slobber nose tackle. You could have saved $10 million a year to get somebody in there. Look at what the Rams have done to rebuild their defensive line. Look at what happened over in Washington. I mean, they had the 32nd worst defense last year. And look at what's happening over there in 1 year. They're in everybody's top 10 right now. Why didn't that happen to us? And we had, Quinn in for a second interview, right? Right?
They did.
And you know what? Why did they let him leave the building? I'll bet you it's this. I bet they wanted him to agree to Vance Joseph staying on the staff or agree to having Kyler as long-term quarterback. I bet there was a quid pro quo that Bidwell is so infamous for, that you will have you, but you've got to accept this. Or at least he was asked those questions. I mean, when you look at what happened at Houston, you look at what happened in Washington, it's so frustrating to see. There are overnight solutions, obviously, with defensive-minded coaches. And here's my question to Marcos first, because I want to hear his answer to this. At what point in hiring a defensive-minded head coach does it matter that your defense sucks? And I mean, it's really bad. I mean, and every year you're going to use excuses of injuries. I mean, the way these guys were treated as fat cats in the preseason, it's no wonder they were injured. They didn't play them a lick in preseason games when they could have used the chemistry and the and the conditioning. I mean, I watched that first game. Neither Bilal Nichols nor Justin Jones looked in football shape. Neither of them. And I'm saying to myself, they're going to get hurt. I mean, I'm not lying there. It translates. Because mentally, when you're not, up to the par, right? So, Marcos, at what point is having a defensive-minded head coach an issue if your defense stinks?
Yeah, so obviously, I'm a big defensive proponent. I will say this, that if you want long-term success in the NFL and you want to have a staple, like, being one of those teams that goes back to the playoffs and maybe even threatens to win that championship, like, For instance, the Kansas City Chiefs, they're better defensively now. Spags has that defense chiming, and you could say that that's the reason why they won the Super Bowl last year. That's what at least you can see from some breakdowns of it. The fact that he owns the offensive coordinator slash the coach of the 49ers. See, that's what happens when I'm put on the spot. I forget names.
Yeah.
Kyle Shanahan, he owns them to this day, and Kyle Shanahan's supposed to be a renovative type of this is the best mind in football as far as offense. So when you're a defensive minded head coach and you come over, you expect a scheme to come over, you expect a success to come over. So you're thinking to yourself, okay, they're going to put their scheme in place and the defense should be at least better from what it was before, or at the very least they have better plans for wherever the defense is going. You would think that in that scenario you'd have a lot of support to try to get more of that defense going, because if, let's just say next year we're still talking about how bad this defense is, and let's say the offense is chiming, we're going to look towards probably upgrading at that position, and we'd have to get rid of Jonathan Gannon at that point, because we're not going to keep him around, because if you hire another defensive coordinator, it's just going to clash with scheme, and he's not going to go for that. He's going to want his guy, so you're going to have to get rid of the coach and then start over with that. So if his defense is not carrying over and his philosophy isn't carrying over, then that presents a major problem. Now let's look at the other side of the coin when it comes to like another defensive coach that I wanted the Cardinals to interview and get, which was the coach of the Houston Texans. I said, DeMeco Ryans. That was the guy that I championed so hard for, not just because of the scheme, but because of how he came out being the type of person that people were willing to die for. Like his ex-players were saying, like, I don't want him to leave. Right. I'll die for that guy. I'll fight for that guy. They did two crazy things. And now hindsight, looking 2020, it almost seems like the Texans got one up on us than us getting one up on them. They got their quarterback of the future, and then they traded for their pass rusher of the future. They knew that they had to get something going on defense for DeMeco Ryans to at least bring that defense up to something that's like semblance of like, hey, this is not just a bad defense. Jesus Christ. Jonathan Grenard got himself a big contract, who I wanted as a Cardinal so bad. Right. I wanted the Cardinals to sign Grenard. Now he's killing it with Minnesota. But he emerged from that defense alongside with Will Anderson being a rookie, going forth as one of the best pass rushers going forth. And of course, they solved their issues by drafting their quarterback, who looks like they're going to give him another 2 years of good quarterback play, which is going to open up that playoff window for them. Yeah. And I mean, and yes, I know Josh Jones, like he's a practice body. He's on the Ravens. Good luck trying to be a starter there. And he had to be behind Laramie Tunsil in Houston. So I feel sad for what happened to him, but it's neither here nor there. We don't live in the alternative. We live in this timeline. But when I'm talking about how they are going for DeMeco Ryans, is they're not going to try to be like, hey, you're here to be the coach, but we're going to focus heavily on getting the offense straightened out. And on defense, we're just going to expect for you to like bring this defense up. Well, if his defense doesn't come up by next year, I think people are going to start calling for like, hey, maybe we need to upgrade. Maybe we need to go back to offensive-minded head coach, and we need to get ourselves a good defensive coordinator out there, like an up-and-coming defensive coordinator. And it just, to me, it just doesn't look good on his behalf. If you came over from the Eagles having that great defense and them talking trash to you, saying like, good thing we let you go, good thing you're gone, and then the end result is, hey, look at what's going on in Arizona. Like, that defense is still not chiming. We told you it was the talent that was ultimately what your deciding factor was. You didn't bring anything to the table when it comes to that.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this one. I think that I look, again, big picture, 3-year plan process. I'm a process over results guy. And if you don't know what that, aren't familiar with that, it doesn't mean results don't matter. It's the idea, focus on having the right process and the results will happen. But if you, but if you focus on the results, sometimes the results are anomalous. Like Kime was a results first person, and he went with the splash signs, and they had short success, but long term it decimated the roster, right? So the right process will work out, but sometimes in the short run, it doesn't work the way you wanted. And I think their process was get the offense right first, coach up the defense, draft, build through the draft, know that our guys are going to take their lumps. They're going to take some time to develop, but we're going to trust our coaching staff, to do it, to make the most out of our young guys. And by year 3, we're going to have the players on the roster we want. Now, some things didn't go their way. I mentioned earlier 2 key pass rush injuries. That matters a lot.
Yep.
The process of signing Nichols and Jones and the defensive line was good process. You get guys who have started the NFL, who haven't had injuries, who have been decent but not star players, and you bring them in and raise the floor. Well, they both play really bad. They get injured, right? It's just the process I think was good. And I think the process also included that by year 3, we will have drafted, all the guys we need. And I still think next year we're going to see it, probably another edge rusher plus Darius Williams in year 2, Ojulari hopefully healthy and back. So I think the whole plan was get the offense going first, coach up the defense, know that the defensive guys are going to struggle a little bit because they're young guys, and they are playing their young guys, which Vance Joseph didn't do enough, right? We complained about that, right? So we're seeing the young guys play, and so I think they have the big picture look at it. So are there some mistakes along the way? You could argue, yeah, you could argue they should have signed another pass rusher in free agency. I wouldn't have gone all out for a big name guy. I want to draft and develop a guy, but listen, if Monty makes a trade and the trade deadline is still, yet to pass, if he trades for like a Harold Landry or Azeez Ojulari, all of a sudden I think we've got a very different story. Like, hey, that's a good move, to kind of shore us over for now and then develop guys. So I'm not I guess big picture, I don't think there's this major kind of pathology to what they've done. And I don't think the defensive coaches are failing in general. I think I think they just haven't had the players to work with because of some injuries. And you can argue maybe they should have added another pass rusher. But overall, I'm a big believer in draft guys, develop them, and pay big money to those guys. Like, we're going to pay Trey McBride top of the market money, and we're going to be happy to do that. But when you try to bring those guys in free agency, what you're doing is you're finding a guy who's like 60% the player McBride is, and you're paying him 80% the salary, right? And that goes for any positions with free agency, right? So, yeah, I would have liked – there's a few little things I wish they would have done differently. I would have loved to see an interior defensive lineman somewhere in the 3rd round last year and this year. Yeah, I would have liked to see that. So there's little things I'd like to see him do differently, but I don't have that macro these defensive coaches aren't doing their job. It's some things haven't gone right. Maybe you can make argument that in retrospect they should have done a few things differently, but I think the process we'll have to judge it next year, really. I mean, if by end of next year this defense isn't solidly middle of the pack and this team isn't a playoff team, then I'm going to have some criticisms. But I think it's the big picture 3-year thing. You only have so many picks. And if you want to build through the draft, you can't just do the Steve Keim thing and bring in all the free agents, and you have to let those young players play and take their lumps. So if by year 3, the result isn't there, then the process maybe hasn't worked.
Joe, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
You're re-signing Buddha?
I'm sorry, who?
Buddha.
Man, this is so tough because I love Buddha. I love what he brings right to the team. I'm really torn on that. I guess it depends on the price. I love him. He's one of my favorite Cardinals of all time, but objectively speaking, safety approaching 30 years old, safety is not a position you want to, invest tons of money in. We have 2 guys on pretty good sized contracts, and you drafted Rabbit, who you just talked about loving, right? So maybe you let Rabbit be that guy and you let Buddha move on. And it hurts me to say that because I love him, right? But it's one of those things, you sometimes you have to sacrifice your sacred cows, and it's kind of an old saying. And is it smart I don't know. I'm really torn on that. I really am. My heart wants to re-sign him.
Can I just
fix?
Oh, my bad.
Go ahead.
I mean, isn't Buddha really our middle linebacker? I mean, listen.
Yeah, in this sort of a scheme, at least they've used him in all sorts of different ways this season versus last year. Yeah, last year he was more in that too high safety type of scheme
Yeah.
where there was very little. This year they were able to at least move forward. I think part of that may have been, you look at Arizona last year, they had Jalen Thompson had to play a lot of nickel, and they didn't really have a nickel corner. Garrett Williams is finally been able to come on somewhat this year. They at least have trust with what Starling Thomas has been able to do. He's had to stay a lot deeper in a lot of zone where there's been a lot of completions in front of him. And we've been able to at least see that Sean Murphy Bunting, they kind of were like, we're going to put you here as far as if you're going to be that guy on an island. He just has not been capable, I think, to the degree that these offenses that have been just kind of picking on and attacking him. Coverage got a bit better when we're able to see Max Melton not just step up or not be quite as physical in some places, but it's kind of where you can see a little bit of the, I guess, like with the Cardinals, the idea is supposed to be with Joe when it comes to like with talking about how careers go. It's hard to remember that the NFL is ultimately a window of opportunity for a lot of guys. Like Adrian Wilson, he probably had, I would say, in 2011 was probably one of his better years. He was a Pro Bowler that season. In 2012, at 33 years old, that was like his last season in the NFL. He went to the Patriots and just didn't even go there. You're talking about like someone who you're going to talk about like an all like caliber, all world safety. I think Adrian clears Buddha pretty easily in that regard. So it is one of those places of being a physical spot, a physical position, and the way that things work, you're kind of also looking at, hey, you got this Adrian Taylor Demerson guy. You're going to let him sit on the bench for the next 3 years or so because you do have Jalen Thompson under contract through, I believe it's through the next 2 years, through next year. So you're probably going to be looking at with how it's going to set up. I've said that it's really tough to be able to know for sure because your best case scenario, honestly, is pay your star players who are going to be around for a long, long time, like a Paris, and you're hoping a Marvin Harrison Jr. Even with Buda Baker when he's younger, you like wanted to keep him through this age 30 season. It's one of those places of where ultimately you have to be able to make the best use of some of your resources. And the longer you go on without some of those guys, you know, being able to replace them when they do kind of fall off at the very end, you kind of end up stuck. And I think the best example of that really is you kind of went all in on an old Rodney Hudson. You got probably the best games we've seen out of Kyler Murray's career through those 7 games, and he was only really able to make it through those 7 games. So I think what I've said is that from a leadership and talent standpoint, you almost have to trust your process to be able to say that even if we let a Buda Baker go, that Rabbit is going to be someone who would step up and be like kind of that next one. And we used to see the Cardinals do this all the time. We would see, hey, look, Cardinals have a awesome safety in Adrian Wilson. They've let him go at least after the 2012 season. Tyrann Mathieu comes in, has 4 incredible years as a safety spot. Rashad Johnson is back there. They get Tony Jefferson, is just like this surprise that no one expected. What happens in 2017? Well, Buda Baker comes in all of a sudden, end of the season. Tyrann Mathieu goes into a different role. Buda starts getting a lot more snaps. Buda Baker then takes over into that role. It's kind of that cyclical nature for the most part, and teams really end up missing in a lot of ways because you look at how hard it is to find quarterbacks in this league. That's really where a lot of times teams will go out and be like, hey, we need to bring this guy in, get that rookie quarterback contract, have a star quarterback. We can win these games, get that job security. I think that's part of where Arizona was. I mean, Kyle drafted 2 rookie quarterbacks when he really at least was going through that area of having to move on from Carson Palmer. They were able to kind of reset very quickly, and we got to see them grow over the years. Something the Commanders are doing now. And I don't think it's to say that one is right or wrong. I think it's making sure you know what your team build sort of is and then having that vision. Because we want to talk about signing Dan Quinn, bringing some guys in to be able to run that defense, having the offense that they've had. Jaden Daniels is making 2% of their salary cap this year. Like they've got that rookie quarterback contract. Kyler Murray's making 5 times that this year. He's making like 20% of the salary cap. So if you want to move on from a Kyler Murray, draft another quarterback in that top 4, like that could be a way to build the team. If you're wanting to say, hey, we've got a quarterback that we can win some games with now, build around him, and then focusing on some of the strengths, like Commanders brought in Cliff Kingsbury. Their red zone offense has been one of the worst, at least for the most part in the NFL. Brian Robinson would do very good when they get through there, but field goals last week against the Bears, they basically needed a Hail Mary to get into the end zone at the end of the game because they had just not been able to punch one in. Cardinals, on the other hand, you're like, they've been lights out in the red zone, and it makes sense. Kyler can run. James Conner can run. You've got Trey McBride over here. You've even had Michael Wilson be able to get wide open just because of some of that savvy where he's able to find that soft spot in the zone. They've been able to convert. And both of these teams are honestly like in places where you say the Commanders are at 6-2, Cardinals are at 4-4, but you at least feel like they're at least building something moving forward where you feel like their teams are not quite at their peak or their zenith yet. They're still building. And that's something that I think when it comes to being able to manage, you have to be able to get stuff right at the quarterback spot. You have to be able to get stuff right at some of these key places like Joe has talked about. But I think that you're right. At the end of the day, you do also need to see progress to know, hey, Cardinals are at 4-4. Some team you may say, this team's 4-4. We got to sell. Like the San Francisco 49ers, if you told me that they were going to be 4-4 at this point of the season with all of those guys on these contracts, on these deals, all trying to kind of be able to get into their Super Bowl, it just has not been a very good season for them overall. You're talking about what happens if Trent Williams retires after this season. You're going to have to pay, you're probably going to pay Brock Purdy more than a Kyler Murray because he has that Super Bowl appearance. You're going to have to probably refresh and reset if you're going to be the Niners for the most part. And I think by giving some of that time and being able to kind of see where they are, Cardinals, at least at this stage in the season, we probably would have said they would have been around 3-5 to 4-4. You're only responsible for what you can do as a team. We had no idea that the Rams were going to be so hit by injuries and that defense without Aaron Donald, they've been one of the worst run defenses. Like they went out and brought in a good edge rusher, at least in Jared Verse. They also got Braden Fisk in the second round. And I'm watching on tape and we went over this with Marcos. I'm like, look at how small his little arms are that are Will Hernandez is just moving him out of the way for James Conner to be able to run through. So you're like, there's going to be hits, there's going to be misses. I still think Fisk is athletic enough that he can still be able to be a contributor. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of pieces. And I think that it's good to be able to take in with a grain of salt because some teams, they've really had huge expectations for this season and it's been huge disappointments. Like the Packers, for example, went in thinking this is our Super Bowl year and they end up having 2-6, finally get to that 3-6 mark and say, all right, we're probably not going to trade Hassan Reddick, despite the fact that he's on a 1-year deal. We're in the AFC East with some pretty tough games coming up, including against the Cardinals on the road. They just had elected Cardinals fans. We've been able to be, I think, pleasantly surprised at being able to be 4-4 throughout this part of the season, especially with some of the games that they put on. We've seen all of their flaws got exposed in a couple of games where the offense struggled and the defense really was just an open flesh wound, just bleeding out. The fact that their next half of the schedule is a bit easier and that they're at least 4-4 to this point, I think does give some optimism that I don't know if this team is going to necessarily be able to get into that playoff team caliber, but if you finish the season like going into the last couple weeks of the year, say you're at like 7 or 8 wins with a chance to be able to do that 2013 Cardinals, win a bunch of games down the stretch. That was one of the most talented 10-6 teams, and they really needed to halfway through the season hit the eject button on Levi Brown. They were like, this isn't working for the most part. We're going to bring in Bradley Sewell, and we're going to bootleg Carson Palmer to the right on a lot of plays because he just is not able to do more than buy a few seconds of time. But they're able to win games with the defensive talent that they had. That may be probably the best case scenario for the Cardinals. The worst case, I think, obviously, is you continue to drop games, get more exposed. It seems like that it's a small curve. But it does feel like they're at least building more and have a foundation to build on that I think is set for the next couple of years at least. You're not talking about a 32-year-old receiver. You're not talking about some of these players. I agree with Joe that I'm willing to give it some time to say, just let's see some of that talent. But I also agree with you, Marcos, and you, Walter, that if you don't go out and get an edge rusher for a team that is 4-4, you're letting down not just the fans, at least, who would hope that this team could take advantage, but letting down other people on the team as well, given the fact that they have a really big opportunity in front of them with some of this schedule. And I think you'll want to see that payoff where they bring that guy in. Suddenly the defense starts functioning better. We saw that with the Chicago Bears last season. They bring in Sweat as their Montez Sweat. And it seemed like their defense just clicked because all of a sudden they had an actual alpha pass rusher who could get after the passer. They had the cornerbacks in the coverage. And they had obviously gotten rid of Roquan Smith, but they brought in 2 veterans to be able to make it work. And with the rookie on that quarterback contract, they've been able to go out and bring in a DJ Moore, bring in a Keenan Allen. Where they've struggled has been they brought in Braxton Jones to be that guy for them at the tackle spot, and he's no Paris Johnson, unfortunately, as far as that's been. It's just part of the way that things have kind of panned out for the most part is that it really feels like there's areas that we could complain about. But like Joe said, when you're looking at how Arizona's been and then seeing where other teams have been this season, you feel at least like you're in a more positive space the last few weeks. And that's something I think Cardinals fans can at least be a little proud of, is to say, we were expected probably to be in the running for another top 5 pick, finish last in the division. We technically control our own destiny now as Cardinals fans for winning those games to stay in, to be able to potentially have a shot at, if not the NFC West crown, being able to at least make a push for the playoffs, which I think is where this team, after losing Kyler Murray for a year and essentially having just a bankrupt season, that's kind of where they probably should be.
I got something to say about Buda Baker. Because So do we re-sign him or do we just let him go into free agency? Him being as getting to his 30s and stuff, and the value that he brings is not high when it comes to like a defensive like unit. But Buda Baker to this defensive unit is really high, because I can't recall any other safety that can storm the alley like Buda Baker does. Now, This is what Walter said. He's basically playing Mike. The reason why he's saying that he's basically playing Mike is because when he comes down from the third level, I've watched him do this time and time again. He's so good at timing the snap. He watches the cues with the motion. He starts kind of lurking down to the second level, and then he takes off full speed once that ball is snapped. So when people are trying to set up their blocking schemes for like the run game, they have an idea of who's going to block who. So they're like, if you have the pulling guard going from left side of formation to the right side, he's taking care of the Mike linebacker or the Will linebacker on that side. Suddenly you have a Mike or Will on that side getting blocked while Buda Baker's coming free right when that ball gets snapped. He's good at being able to stop mid play and adjust his pursuit angle, and he gets down. Like, look at that, just a great example of how he can storm the alley and how he times the snap. He's already almost at the same level as the linebackers are when that ball gets snapped. When Tua has the ball in his hands, he's basically like a yard behind them, and so he has that momentum already working for him, whereas somebody like Kaiser White's flat-footed waiting for the ball to get snapped, and then he can take off. He's already see what I mean? He does this.
He's running after the check down.
He's at least doing this every 3 plays, and in every running play, he tries to gauge it in that manner where he's timing it. He's watching the quarterback. He's watching the center. He's looking to see when that movement's going to happen. He's looking at the people motioning, because most of the time there's one motion per snap. So he's already kind of coming downfield or downhill to be able to manipulate the play. That's the reason why it's so hard to give up somebody like that, because I don't see any other safeties doing this where they're timing it, where they're on the balls of their feet even before it gets snapped. So it's hard. I think I would trade away Jalen Thompson and put DTD in. And Jalen Thompson, I love the guy. I do. But I think DTD's time to shine has to be now. Right. And you have to have him under at least a tutelage of Buda Baker, because he's too good of a player even at this age.
I think so much of it comes to the contract. If you have to sign a 4-year contract or a 3-year contract to keep Buda with a big cap hit down the road, then what's going to end up happening is there's going to be another player you really like that we don't get to keep because of that contract. Now, if you can get him on a 2-year deal where the dead cap hit is front loaded, right, and where it's not as hard to get out of it later if you need to, I'm all for it, right? Because the player, there's no question about the player. The question is the tough decision about roster and salaries long term.
Yeah, there's, in my mind, 3 reasons why you absolutely re-sign him. And 3 years could be 2 years, actually look like 2 years when you look at the guaranteed money. But I'd love to see him do 3 years and work it out. what player in the NFC, what defender in the NFC West is feared by all three of our rivals the most?
Mhm.
They will say
Yeah.
hands
Buddha.
down,
Yeah.
Buda Baker.
Where's
Yeah.
3? Yeah, where's number
Secondly
3?
is you don't let alpha leaders leave the building. Look at what the Tennessee Titans did, which Monty was a part of, by letting A.J. Brown out of that building. Look at what they did letting, Derrick Henry out of that building.
Wow.
You
I don't
could
know
have
if that
said-
was a Monty decision for AJ Brown so much
No,
as
no,
they
I'm just
immediately
saying he's
fired their
part of
general
the-
manager.
I'm just
after
saying
that.
he's part of the leadership
Yeah,
team
yeah.
that allowed that to happen, right? I mean, so there's just a colossal idiotic mistake. All right. So when you have an alpha leader, you keep him in the building. I mean, there's 2 alpha leaders on this team that are kicking ass, and they're such special players that if you take them out of the building, we don't know what's going to happen. But we know what's happening with them in the building, and with James Conner and Buda Baker, we have hit a gold mine on both ends. And here's the other thing about Buda is he disguises more defensive weaknesses for you. I mean, he covered for Chandler Jones for years. Chandler Jones will tell you this. He knew Buda was behind him, so it gave Chandler Jones
versus the run.
the
Exactly.
freedom to rush inside, rush outside, do whatever he wanted to get. That's why he was so successful sacking the quarterback, is that he knew Buda would have his back on contain. So, it's just and it looks right now like the front office is leaning in that direction, because when asked this week about Buda being on the trade market, and there's all these rumors he's going to the Eagles, they said, no, Buda's a huge part of what he's doing, what we're doing, and what we want to do. So
None of us
There's
disagree about how good he is and how important he is, right? And the only question for me is, who is he 3 years from now, and how much are we paying him 3 years from now, right? If we can get him on a 2-year deal, even if it's a pretty good sized contract, we've got the cap space. But in 2 or 3 years from now, we're having to pay some of those guys we've drafted, right? And we talk about guys like Zach Allen that we would love to kept. Like sometimes those guys get let go because you don't manage the cap that well, right? So I'm with you.
That was an issue with Steve Keim
Yeah.
for a number of
Yeah.
years, where we talked about kicking the can down the road to the point where, like last year, remember, they were still paying Rodney Hudson and JJ Watt money because they were like, we're going to fit everything on this team. And I think that's part of the advantage, you can say, at least, of a team like the Broncos can go out, sign Zach Allen to a big deal. Their defense needed it badly. They've at least been able to produce this year, but they're having to kind of get it done with, a rookie quarterback. Whereas with Arizona, you're like, they kick the can down the road for a huge number of years. We don't know what's going to happen with Buda, but at least there's confidence, where previously, if you'd told me entering 2022, hey, guess what? You're entering this year. By the time you get to the end of 2023, Kyler's going to be coming off of an injury. DJ Humphries is going to be hurt. You're going to have one of the worst defenses in the NFL. You're going into Buda Baker's final year. You haven't traded him. You haven't gotten anything there. I think Monty's been very key on keeping him. You're going to basically just be entering the end of that season. You're like, where is my star players coming from? How did we hit in the draft? To be able to go out and find a Dadrian Taylor-Demerson, who right now is not playing, despite having, I think he's got the highest PFF grade on the Cardinals. He's played like 40 snaps, because they've paid their 2, a Pro Bowl, and probably should have gotten a Pro Bowl nod previously, just didn't end up lining up in Jalen Thompson for last year. They at least have a set future moving forward within that position. But what's really tough is, like you say, there's the emotional aspect, where it's really hard for me to just be able to take that Buda Baker jersey down off of the wall and just to kind of like take some duct tape, put rabbit over that. It just doesn't fit, doesn't feel right. It's one of those areas of the game where you have to be able to manage both the star players that you have and being able to look at the team as a whole. And I think this is part of a learning thing for Michael Bidwell, who always has had, Walter, you talked about drafting Marvin because of keeping the fans happy, getting star players, some of that. And I do think that's been part of what we've seen with Arizona, has been needing to move away from just bringing in a couple of star guys, being able to have that team that it's like that match that burns bright and burns quick and then goes out, versus that long sustaining candle. To me, Dadrian Taylor-Demerson is one of those candle type of players, whereas that's how Buda Baker's been for a huge number of years. The hope is that you can take that candle, light another candle with it, and continue as that flame is able to be passed on to.
Yeah,
Finish the metaphor in that regard.
Except, we watched Buda Baker single-handedly take out Kyron Williams and Cooper Kupp in the same game.
Yeah.
I mean, Sean McVay has been kicking our ass. So much so last year he was laughing on a morning show after he played us, saying how easy it was to get even his basic bread and butter plays for chunk yards against us last year. Buda Baker came in, and the coaches have been smart. One of the things that Nick Raylis has been doing very smart is now he's consulting with Buda about game planning.
Yeah.
And, the game plan was coming into that game, they were going to run blitz and they were going to double Cooper Kupp with Buda. And look at how they took a McVay offense and derailed it from the get-go in that. And that offense has bounced back, by the way, in other games. They're balling. Yeah. Okay. I mean, so this is why Buda, and here's the other thing. Buda Baker's virtually no Cardinal has ever lived up to a second contract the way Buda Baker has, other than Larry Fitzgerald. And that's why I would call him the Larry Fitzgerald of our defense. Because, I mean, is he playing at a Pro Bowl level this year, Marcos?
Yeah, he is. He's as far as like stats and what he's showing on film, I think he's like probably, if not the best at, because I said he can storm the alley really well. The one thing obviously we talk about is coverage, but I mean, when it comes to that coverage one-on-one on a slot, like on a 6'5", 4.3 runner, like it's hard to win against that. But other than that, yes, I do think he's a Pro Bowler this year.
Yeah, and so that'd make 7 years Pro Bowls.
Yeah. And the only thing as far if there's only any reason why he wouldn't get in, it'd only be because Brian Branch and Kirby Joseph are playing so well, and then Jesse Bates moved divisions, and now he's with Atlanta. He honestly is deserving, I think, of that spot, and that's one of those places of like I agree with you, Walter, in that you have one of those talents like that one. You are looking at where you're at, saying, is we're in a team where we're not quite there yet? Do you end up having someone say, hey, like teams are calling about Buda Baker? Do you reset? I think that there is an emotional element to the game where I'd say it's the kind of guy that I would want to have down the stretch. And if there's an injury that happens, God forbid, I know at least that I can bring in someone like Rabbit to be able to fill in that spot in that role. But you'd rather be able to see this team make a push, be able to make a playoff game, much less with the team in first place right now, be able to win it. I think when it's with those second contracts, it's usually the case of, and Joe and I, we talked about this a lot, Joe, about the second contracts, third contracts, once you get to a year-to-year sort of contract. And then you kind of end up in that spot where it's essentially just, hey, you're the quarterback contract. You're just going to keep making that money until essentially your skill set declines. We've seen some of that in the case of Russell Wilson, who he made that contract, made that Kyler Murray type money, and did not put out that Kyler Murray type production that we've been able to see. Now he's with the Steelers, and you're kind of saying, oh, they've got Russell Wilson on essentially a rookie quarterback contract. He's now exceeding some of that with a great defense, with a lot of different players over there. And he's still not playing as well as Kyler, despite the fact that Kyler's got way less talent on defense. On the offensive side, at least you've got James and a couple of different receivers and weapons for sure. But when it's come to like some of those big plays, the explosiveness, it's an interesting balance to look at, because the biggest question I know I had was, hey, Chandler Jones, he got that second contract. He got it. He wanted to. Were you going to sign him to that third contract? And it felt like if they were going to do it, they probably would have signed him much earlier in the process. It was that second Hassan Reddick contract, I think, with Arizona we got to see. Probably wasn't going to be the right fit for him. He's been able to go and make that money elsewhere. He also didn't make some of that money this year with holding out, trying to get another deal from the New York Jets. it's an interesting case of, like you said, because you're having to kind of balance all of these different chess pieces all at once, while at the same time, it's like, hey, you've got your queen as a player on the board, your most powerful piece. You're paying that $40 million a year. You've got a pawn that's been able to advance all the way to the side that's become a queen. That could be your Adrian Taylor Demerson, at least after being used as a pawn for so much as a depth role. Oh, you've been able to say, you get those guys in free agency like a James Conner, who's already passing up, for the most part, David Johnson as far as for being top 10 in rushing all time for the Cardinals. You got him from a team that didn't want him. You signed him to that kind of second contract, and he's exceeded it by pretty much every imagination, to the point where we don't have to wonder if he's going to finally hit 1,000 yards like he did last year. We just feel like it's almost a guarantee at this point from what we're being able to see on the field, regardless of a large injury. It really is one of those places of where, when we talk about this team and are covering for a long period of time, there's a lot of things that have been very similar, very similar, very similar. What we're seeing this year has been something we probably haven't seen since the Jim Hart era, which is a young franchise quarterback who you have under contract, and then the team going out and trying to draft and develop talent around him with this veteran to be able to kind of win games consistently over the future, versus here's a nice flash up with Boomer, here's a flash with Carson, here's a flash with Kurt. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, is this sustainable as it moves on? Because like you guys are talking about, Buda's a free agent. You've got other guys. Kaiser White is a free agent. Are you going to have to draft starters for that next year? Bring it in. It's going to be really interesting to see what Arizona does.
Real quick, I just want to make one quick point
on
the Buda. Again, my position is don't trade Buda, and if you can get him on a 2-year deal, that you can
Same
make
here. Yeah.
But I want to just make a point. If we went back to 2017, and aside from my beard having a little less gray, if you took this conversation we just had and swapped out Buda and Rabbit for the names Tyrann and Buda, it would have been the same conversation, more or less, right? We would have been saying, you keep Tyrann, you keep Tyrann. I know there's some injury stuff, right? But Buda came in, and Tyrann's been great since then, right? But we don't look back at that as some major mistake necessarily, because we have Buda. And so does Rabbit, that candle thing you were talking about, right? So it's the emotion, you pull it out, and like those conversations sometimes play themselves out again. So, but again, I hope we keep him for another year or two.
Yeah, well, the thing about Tyrann, sadly, was he dogged it for 2 years after he got the bag. I mean,
yeah, and he was injured a lot too. He did play the most. Yeah, he didn't. Okay.
Game.
Yeah, and he was hurt from the ACL. He was really beat up.
You've never seen Buda Baker have an off button.
Yeah,
you've never seen it. Okay, and he keeps himself in tremendous football shape the way James Conner does. These guys, and the way Larry does. That's why Larry rarely got injured. Larry, when you have, and that's why I'm so hopeful with Kyler this year. He looks like it's the best shape of his career. That when you're in that kind of shape, sometimes you feel a little invincible, and with a reason. You got a confidence to you. Buda Baker, I mean, to do what he does, he needs to be in like rock football shape. I mean, look at the way the dude tackles. I mean, it's just awesome. And think of how infectious that is, playing around, with other people. Our tackling grade this year is not so bad. On PFF, we're in the, I think, we're in the 14 area. Buda has so much to do with that, in setting that tempo. So, but here's the thing that's so encouraging to me about it is we've never seen an off button from Buda. We saw it with Tyrann, and we saw it with David Johnson, sadly. And there are guys we gave long-term contracts to. We saw it with Chandler Jones. I mean, Chandler Jones was hit or miss in certain games. So that's what gives me hope, Joe. And I agree with you. 2-year deal would be great. Yeah. If we can do it, call it 3, but the guaranteed money sets it up for a 2.
Basically, that's the same thing, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. And I'd give them incentives big time too. More Pro Bowl money, playoffs, get to the playoffs, you get X amount. But man, the leadership thing is so important.
Hey,
too.
I don't disagree with anything you're saying about who he is as a player, and I love him for that. Right? For me, again, it's that question of 3 years from now, what's going on cap wise.
Yeah.
And Tyron, like you said, there's a psychological element to players too. Tyron had a terrible second ACL tear, essentially, like after he tore it in 2013. He goes out there in 2016, 2017, plays most snaps of any player, at least on the field. But at the same time, he just really had, like you said, as far as for where you're talking about the love of the game, you see Buddha as a young player is like being able to see it kind of relit. I think of James Conner as well with the injuries he got in Pittsburgh, having his passion reignited when he came to Arizona. I think that you're looking for, that's why love of the game has got to be the top thing that you look for in a prospect. It's part of why I think they were super passionate about saying, hey, we're not just going to go ahead and take the second best offensive tackle. We want to go up and get someone in Paris for the most part, who, when you see it, you can see it in pretty much every rep at least, is out there for the most part with that passion. It's one of the things that we even talked about with Marvin Harrison Jr. this season, where a lot of times some of the complaints had been he's running a lot of these post routes, X routes. I pulled Marcos after 2 weeks of this first week of the season. I said, well, he's running the routes that Zach Pascal was running late last year to open things up for guys underneath. Like I say, I can understand you got to do your job as a player, but at the same time, like part of it is being able to have a love for the game in some area. And then last week, what we know at least was that Kyler Murray talked to Marvin throughout the week, said, what are some of the routes you like? What are some of the ways that you can at least be able to thrive on? What are some of these working at using the playbook that we have? And we got to see the huge difference between Marvin's post game last week, where he's like, the season hasn't gone the way I wanted to, versus he got some of the targets, got the ability to kind of show up and show out for over 100 yards receiving, including one of those crazy throw and catch combos where he's running to come back over the middle of the field versus just being locked onto the outside left-hand corner. And you're like, and he just had this exuberance, this vibrancy out of him. And I think you're right in terms of you want to find those guys that are driven from within, but you also want to be able to find those guys, put them in positions to make some of those plays. Buddha's been on a different level this year because he's been coming down into the box. He's been able to make some of those tackles. And it is one of those things of, at the end of the day, coaching is ultimately about having to manage a lot of these complex factors as well as the guys you're going up against. And for the most part, I think we can at least say we're not sure how this coaching staff is going to end. We don't know how it's going to end with some of these players, but at least from what we've seen so far, it's enjoyable Cardinals football that we've been able to see, unlike the end of 2022, where the team just looks like they're kind of ready to get done with the season. They're ready for J.J. Watt to get that standing ovation in his last game as he gets 2 sacks, putting forth that last effort before retirement. Last year, we saw Arizona with this coaching staff compete in games they shouldn't have competed with, beat a Cowboys team that went to the playoffs. You got to see some of that spark that the coaching staff was lit. You've seen a little bit more fires pick up. And now we get to see them as they come into a game against the Chicago Bears, who are a team that is really trying to figure out that fire, because this is their, I think, 3rd or 4th year of their head coach. They've got a new offensive system, a new quarterback in Caleb Williams, and a defense that is pretty packed and loaded. We don't have enough time, I think, with how long we've gone to go over a full game preview, but I do want at least to see how you guys feel about this Cardinals team with their offense being the best part of their team. It's a great Bears defense. This Bears defense, at least for the most part, has been super good in the red zone against a Cardinals team that has been nails every time they're in the red zone. Whereas on the offensive side, Caleb Williams has shown some great flash plays. They actually kind of got their offense figured out, but it was against the 3 worst ranked defenses in the NFL. And the Arizona Cardinals, on the other hand, have played some of the toughest teams. I have this as a game that I think Arizona can win and I hope should win, but a lot of it comes down to some of these team metrics here, as far as when we're talking about the power rankings and everything else. Like, Arizona has not been that great offensively overall. They've not been that great defensively for the most part. I should say Arizona has been good overall on offense, at least compared to the Bears. The biggest thing that's really interesting to me is that strength of schedule played that comes up and how their quarterback does under pressure. So we're talking about, what does pressure create? Does it create diamonds or does it burn through? What we've kind of seen for this year is when the passer rating's been kept clean, Kyler Murray's grade 98.8. Under pressure, we've seen at least there's a huge drop-off between the rookie quarterback and Caleb Williams and Kyler Murray, at least, who's made some impressive plays, at least with his legs and with his arm under pressure. How do you guys see this panning out for the most part? Let's start at least with Joe for right now, at least while Walter's taking a moment to step away, for how you see this game could play out.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of go back to the what I said earlier about like what do we believe about this team, right? What's the story about who the Cardinals are? And I mentioned that, every team we've lost to was elite, right? Every team we've lost to has 6 wins, all 4 of them, right? And every team that's in the middle of the pack with us, we've beaten. This
Yep.
is another team in the middle of the pack with us, right? They're 3-5. So to me, this tells us, like, if they beat them, then this tells us this is who the Cardinals are. They're one of the better middle of the pack teams. They beat the teams that are in the same tier with them, right?
You're not elite, but you're one of those things where you go from that mid tier. If you guys have seen those tier makers, right now it's like 4-4. Cardinals are mid, but when you look at the talent that they've played thus far with the toughest schedule, you're like, you know what we're expecting. They play one of the weaker schedules. They're probably going to be better than mid. And like you said, great game to prove that they are.
So I'm going to go with the data, and the data can change, right? But when you're trying to predict the future, you look at the data to give you trends and understand that there can be variance. But the trends have been Cardinals lose to elite teams, but they beat all the middle tier teams. And this is a middle tier team, and they've done that 4 times. So until they stop winning those games, I'm going to keep picking them in those games. So I think the Cardinals, the data tell me they should win this game, but reality and history tells me obviously things can go differently. So I do think they'll win.
All right. Walter, what are your thoughts, at least for previewing this next game up against the Bears? Do you think the Cardinals have the edge, or is this Bears defense and Caleb Williams going to be a bit much for them, despite the fact it's a home game for Arizona?
Yeah, it's got me nervous. It has a Washington Commanders vibe, who, I'm not sure I would call the Commanders elite, but, and, it's amazing to me what they're doing. And tons of credit to their whole organization for what they're doing. It's just phenomenal. They're getting stuff done, like they're 6-2, but they have a plus 63 point differential. They're kicking ass. And then, unfortunately for us, we have a minus 27. So games like this really worry me. And then watching the Jets this week, I was like, oh shit.
You're like, that's a harder game now.
Looking ahead,
Devontae Adams.
They now think they're going to go on a run, and with the weapons they have and the defense they have, and now this Bears defense concerns me. But what's fascinating is you have the Eberflus, Matt Eberflus, the head coach, right? I mean, Gannon cites him as a previous mentor when they coached together, and really looks up to this guy. And what an interesting side note would be is, Eberflus coming into this game is 0-27 on the road.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you would pick the Cardinals based on that.
Yeah.
However, and if the Cardinals do beat him and Eberflus ends up getting fired, maybe he's part of the answer for getting our defense straightened out with the
You might not be wrong there, yeah.
Gannon has with him. And I think he's one of the best defensive minds in the NFL, and he's been doing a really good job defensively there. So there are some ramifications there. I think it all depends on whether we can bring some momentum into this game, and because if you remember the Bears game last year, I mean,
if that defense shut them down, and that offense with Justin Fields was able to get some big plays to DJ
Justin
Moore.
Fields took him to like 3 touchdowns in a row in the first half. Yeah. Now we did slow him down in the second half, but we couldn't get anything going against that defense, and it was a frustrating day for Kyler. The Cardinals can't afford that scenario this week. They can't let Caleb and the Bears offense march down the field in these long, time-consuming drives. That's driving me crazy. It's keeping our offense, they're doing to us what we want to do to them,
right.
So other teams. So hopefully the Cardinals can get going early and stable. But I just wonder where they're going to get the pressure on Caleb Williams if they're not going to blitz much. Right?
He's got that passer rating being clean is one of the things, at least. So you'll have to be able to figure out some sort of
That's a
pressure.
good
That's
metric.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And whereas Kyler, the passer rating's under pressure. So it could be one of those games where it's a close score and you're like, wow, why this game is so close? And it's like, well, it's because it's a
Well,
bad offense against a bad defense. And on the other side, it's a good offense against a good defense. I will say this, at least why I've picked, and we'll talk to you a few, Marcos, for some closing thoughts. Bears so far this year, for a team that's 4-3 with those metrics, they've played the hapless Titans. They did an okay job against the Texans. Texans have been underperforming and have had some injuries. The Colts they lost to. This is like the Joe Flacco, Anthony Richardson back and forth, who's who. The Rams, when they've been, as we said, inconsistent, this is the no Cooper Kupp, no Puka Nacua Rams. They wallop the Panthers because that's just kind of unfortunately what the Panthers have been. They then played the Jaguars and the Commanders. So you're talking about the Rams defense, the Panthers defense, the Jaguars defense. They just steamroll them in London, kind of like that Rams beating the Cardinals in London game that we've seen at least every once in a while, and probably would have had a win over the Commanders last week if Tyreek Stevenson, like he was supposed to cover Noah Gray. Hail Marys can be a bit fluky. They made the choice to not basically blitz or rush Jaden Daniels. I think they only ran 2, and they had one guy who was supposed to be in coverage, wasn't in coverage. They end up losing that game, and it's caused a lot of issues and stuff in Chicago. After this, they played the Patriots. Before then, they played the divisional opponents in the Packers and the Bears. So they're probably looking at us saying, we got to win at least these next 2 games, or at least one of these next 2, before we go into some of our division games. I think that from what we've seen so far with how things have laid up, I feel like I'm going to want to see the Bears go out and beat the Cardinals to say that it hasn't been fraudulent thus far. Because as we know with Arizona, we've seen them play the Lions close, play the Bills close. Like we've been able to at least see them get blown out as well. I think it's going to ultimately come down to the quarterback play. I think that when you're talking about big time throws and turnover worthy plays, Kyler is at least just lapping Caleb Williams in that so far this year. He's lapping a lot of the NFL in terms of being able to have some explosive plays while keeping turnovers down. I think if you're able to, if you're Nick Rallis, be able to get some sort of a simulated pass rush, have a little bit of a forced mistake, being able to kind of get them out of the rhythm, or Caleb forcing a throw for the most part to someone like Williams, I think that could end up being the difference in what I think could be a much closer game than we would probably like as Cardinals fans. Your hope is that, like you said, Walter, the offense comes out, is able to put up some points. Caleb's having to drop back to pass. Suddenly, you can just play some of that coverage downfield, and once he starts to get a bit of pressure and has to somewhat run around a little bit, unlike Kyler Murray, what we've seen under pressure, Caleb just has not quite been able to put everything together yet consistently enough when he's been under pressure to get the ball to some of those playmakers. Marcos, who do you have winning in this game for Cardinals versus Bears? I do think the home field, it's not in freezing cold Chicago, will have a part in that as well.
Well, I was just looking at the injury report, and so their left tackle is out.
Yeah,
but
Braxton Jones is out.
Montez Sweat is questionable, which if we're Cardinals fans, we know that means he's going to play, because it's always
it's usually a
star's questionable.
Yeah.
And then it's a game time decision, and then we see him out on the field, and we're like, of course he is. Or we're the team that everybody returns against. Like, oh, look, this guy's been out for like 9 weeks, but he's making his comeback against the Cardinals. Whereas we're like, Kyler Murray's supposed to come back against the Browns. We're going to push it back. We're going to put a Clayton Tune out there, and then we're going to have him come back against the Houston Texans. So we don't get that ability to be able to say, you know what, they don't want to come back against us. Yeah, they do. So last year, all the clips that I've seen from this offense and defense is they gave up a big lead right off the bat. You know, we already know their defense is something to be, there's a lot of question marks about it. If that happens again, and I know it's against Caleb Williams and whatnot, for what we want to say about Caleb Williams, the guy knows how to work the middle of the field, and that's going to be tough, because if we have linebackers right now that cannot they cannot defend that middle of the field as well and as consistently as they should, Cole Kmet's just going to eat him up alive. Yeah. So that's going to be the thing that Caleb Williams is going to fall back on. He's going to attack that middle of the field and keep that offense going. On defense, the Cardinals against the Bears, You have to have the same type of game you just had. You have to have a lot of Trey McBride. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and say this before we end the podcast. Marvin Harrison Jr., he's been playing really well this entire time. He has gone open, and he does have a diverse route tree. They move him everywhere on the field. I think that's one of the things that like people are criticizing is that they don't keep him at the X receiver position. But if they keep him at the X receiver position, he's going to be lining up one-on-one.
Johnson.
Yep, exactly.
Right.
So with all the criticism that's been said about the play calling, the play design, and Marvin Harrison Jr., he has to be a big part of this game. Has to be the same type of formula. You're going to pound the ball and probably not get too many yardage, but you want to set up that play action because now we have a hard play action to be able to mount off of, like big gains. Marvin has to be a focal point, but Trey McBride, you have to have a really good game, another good game. And I think this offense can carry us and we can win if that's the formula.
Yep. No, I would agree, at least as far as what the matchups go. With the injuries that you're seeing, the Bears are really going to just be trying to get the ball to Kmet. You've got Moore and Allen for the most part against this defense. I think that there will be yards aplenty. Arizona, for that matter, it's really going to be the matchup on the other side of the field. I think that's going to be where Arizona is going to need to click.
Look at
McKay. Yeah. Well, when I've used him as a pass rusher, he's been really good. Now, this is a huge drop off here because you got Jalen Johnson here, 10th out of 110 corners. Marvin Harrison Jr. rated as the 16th wide receiver. Flip to the other side of the field without having, I believe it's Kyler Gordon over there. You're talking about like one of the top bottom 10. I think he's 12th worst corners in the league with one of the below average guys in Hicks. Very well, Kevin Byard is at least having a good season. They're keeping him back in a lot of the roles, and he's been like kind of their Buda Baker on that side. The matchup here that you want to see is you probably want to see, hey, can we get Marvin Harrison Jr. onto Tyreek Stevenson through whether it's scheme or through the lining up, or can we even make it where we're able to line Trey McBride outside every once in a while? But this is one of those places where you want to see Michael Wilson step up and be able to have a good game as well, where if the Bears come out and say, we're just not going to let Marvin beat us, we know that Trey McBride, you're not going to beat us, you're going to get one-on-one matchups at least against Stevenson. And after last week with what he blew for the most part with Stevenson, like if it ends up being a spot where he blew the Hail Mary play last week, he goes out, gets torched for a 20-yard pickup from Michael Wilson, you could potentially keep having a weak spot in that Bears defense for the most part that's going to be hard to bounce back from. That's where I think at least one of the biggest matchups that comes down to it, as well as how do we see Paris Johnson up against Sweat if he does play? If he is out for the game and they say, we'll bring him back against the Patriots because we just don't want to have him we'll hold him out this week, bring him back against the Patriots to warm up, then we go into these divisional games while we're competing. On the other side of the ball, man, it's going to really come down to, are you able to take advantage of taking out with Jones not playing, with Wright having at least being fine, but some struggling? Can you do well enough in coverage against all of their weapons? Can you get enough of a pass rush against what we've seen is a not good offensive line? Bears injury report, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 offensive linemen. Most of them, I think, except for Emma Degaji, are starters. They're questionable or they're out. And their impact defensive lineman, Montez Sweat, he's also another one at least that we'll have to just see. So this is one of those games of where I think if you're the Cardinals, you look at the game plan for the last few weeks. If you can continually be able to run the ball, get some of these plays down the field, take advantage of those mismatches on offense, your hope then is that you'll be able to force the Bears into being one-dimensional, and that will lead to some mistakes being made on their part. I think that it could be one of those 25 to 23 sort of games where we're talking about it. We're like, all right, here we go. Cardinals are getting the ball back. They're down by 2 points because the Bears went for 2 and didn't get it. You got a chance to be able to go out and win the game yet again at home and get that close victory. I think that could be how Arizona gets it done. And that'll be it for our show, guys. We've been on for almost 2.5 hours. This has been obviously one of our longest shows we've had of the season. Going to be splitting it into a double show for you guys as we preview. Thank you guys so much for joining in with all of us. Let's start with Walter, at least as far as where you can shout out where all of our viewers can find your content.
At WBJ Mitch on Twitter, at revengeofthebirds.com. Seth Cox and I are
holding down the fort
there these days, and
that's right.
Hold up the fort. We missed break, and all our other writers. Hopefully, we'll get you back someday. But and then at Red Rain Podcast, we've been having some fun over there. If you want to check us out on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks
Awesome,
for
man.
having me, guys. Thanks
Absolutely,
a lot.
Walter.
It's always
Take
a
care.
pleasure. And especially to hang out with the Cardinal Rule.
Yeah, Joe, where can you find you as far as for you and your content, at least, especially if people want to dig more into these PFF grades and everything? Because I know that's been something that you've been super active on this year for the most part.
Yeah, you can find me on YouTube at the Cardinal Rule, where I do right now. What I do is a weekly live stream looking at the PFF grades from the game and kind of not just looking at them, but kind of talking about what stories are the numbers telling us, because data needs narrative to make sense, right? So we're looking at what are the themes. You can also find me on Twitter at JOKOMO13. It's a play on my name, JoKomo13. And yeah, it's always great to be with you guys. Of course, you know, you shouldn't be surprised this went 2.5 hours because you invited us and you know how loquacious we are. But I always love talking to all three of you guys. It's always, you guys know what you're talking about. We may have some difference of opinions, but I love how we model disagreeing, but loving and respecting each other, you know, and that's what it's all about. So I'm always glad to hang out with you guys.
Awesome. Then, of course, you can always make sure you follow Walter at Pancake Soul. He's got another logo I know that he's put up there, a little bit different there. And, of course, you can always find me at Blake Murphy7, as well as our Redbird Reboot podcast at Redbird Reboot. Make sure you're following our YouTube channel if you're watching it, at least there on the phone, or if you're watching us, listening to it, I should say, with our podcast later throughout on this Saturday. Thank you guys again so much for tuning in. Cardinals are 4-4. We're halfway here for the most part. They got about 9 more games to be able to finish this thing off. Let's see if they can finish it off strong starting the game in Chicago. That's been the Redbird reboot for us. So Cardinals fans, you guys have been rebooted, which means it's time for us to log off. Have a good Saturday, everybody.